this is what happened to. Like, I could spot an abusive situation a mile away. I had nothing to do. You know what I mean? Like, people that had abusive relationships, like their boyfriends and husbands, like they were like, stay away from her, because I was just very dominant and like just
Here we go. Sorry.
But it did. I mean, it's
Welcome to We Are Libertarians, episode 349. My name is Chris Spangle, and I am here with a bevy of guests. We're going to talk about domestic violence. Yes, we're kind of taking a diversion from our normal programming, and I'll explain why we're talking about it in just a moment. Our good friend Miranda Barnett is here, and she's back. Miranda's back right after this.
why they let me on.
All right, welcome to We Are Libertarians. My name is Chris Spangle, and this is episode 349, recorded on March 26, 2019. And we're just going to jump right into it tonight. Harry's not here. Harry normally, this is a series that we have called The Cost, where we talk about more serious issues, and Harry just can't take it. He told me last week, he goes, nope, I love Miranda, tell her I said hello, but so that's where Harry is this week. Now, I watched Surviving R. Kelly, like probably a lot of people did. It was on Lifetime, I think, and I watched it on Hulu. I don't know what cable is anymore. And I think, having been concerned with domestic violence as an issue of both the heart and law for a very long time, obviously if you listen to episode 141 of the show with Amanda and Mirandas Story, that's really when I discovered the massive issue that nobody really talks about, and so I've always wanted to talk about it. And so when I watched Surviving R. Kelly, I thought, wow, anybody with a daughter or even a son should sit down and watch this when they become a teenager, and I wanted to do a show. So I had, now listen, I'm going to be honest with you both. I am terrible with names. Everybody that listens to this knows. So if I say your name wrong, please correct me. But first and foremost, Miranda Barnett's back. How are you, Miranda?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing really well. It's so nice to see you. You look lovely. You look great and healthy, and
Finally back to being healthy
Yep.
and living a normal life again. It's
Yes.
very good.
so Miranda's World was the podcast that we did together for a long time, and we've been close friends for a couple years, and so I'm glad to see that you're healthy. We're going to kind of talk about your story tonight and kind of annotate it, I guess. And we're joined by Lael.
Yeah, that's right.
Lael.
Like Gail with an L.
Lael Hill.
Yeah.
And then also Shaughnessy Terrell.
Terrell, but
Terrell. That's the one I messed up.
I know, you got Shaughnessy.
All right.
He
So-
had to mess it up somewhere.
Yeah, so why don't you go first, Lael? You and I met on Facebook somehow, and
Because I'm a libertarian.
are you really? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Sometimes.
That's okay.
Kidding.
We're not all perfect
That's
libertarians.
libertarianism at its finest.
Right. And so, tell us a little bit about your background and then what you do now.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm super excited to be here, and thank you so much. I think you care so much about victims, violent crime, and so I'm just totally honored to be part of this podcast. I have a background in social work. Mostly specializing in what's called macro social work practice, which basically means that instead of providing therapy for clients, I kind of want to change the systems and change our communities to where our clients don't need therapy in the first place. And so I do some lobbying, and I work with legislators to really improve the environment that my clients or communities as a whole have, so
Mhm.
that they don't have to seek out social services. So that's sort of what a macro social worker does. But I do direct services at the micro level as well.
Explain that.
So micro level social work service is that direct service one-on-one with a client and sort of helping them get their needs met, advocating for them, connecting them to services or whatnot. And then there's the meso level, which is working with community organizations, like I would work with HPAF or the Julian Center or Mental Health America.
The Julian Center is like the local women's shelter. Be careful about the alphabet soup, because when you do this every day, you know a lot more than maybe we know, and so.
Sure.
But you don't have to go into too much detail about some of the like the names and stuff. But
okay.
If you'll pull that mic too, so you'll talk directly into the. There you go. Perfect.
Is this better?
That's perfect.
Okay, yeah.
Perfect. There you go.
Yeah.
So how did you get into this line of work?
So I was working on with victims of traffic crimes. I was working for anyone that was impacted by impaired driving and underage drinking. And I was before I started working in traffic crimes, I did mental health and child welfare. But traffic crimes really brought me into the criminal justice system and into criminal court. And I had firsthand seen the impact on families and communities really as a whole that crimes had on people. And so I really developed my calling there with working with crime victims, and then I started to look at how I can also serve victims of homicide and domestic violence and sexual violence, and not just serve them but really honor them as a population as a whole, because what I was seeing is that in the criminal justice system, and the Shaughnessy Convention, is that it's a two-party system, meaning that you have the state, which is represented by the prosecutor, who represents the state, and then you have the accused, which is represented by a defendant. And victims are not considered a party, and they are sometimes considered a witness, but they don't have really a right or a say that when it comes to sort of balancing those scales of justice with the rights and the constitutional rights of the defendant. So it gets really hard.
Right, and oftentimes a victim coming out of this doesn't have the financial resources because they're coming out of a situation where the spouse or the partner, and let me just clarify, this is not going to be an F-Men session, because men are victims of domestic violence too. We're going to talk about men who are victims of both sexual and domestic violence along the way. And I will say that if you are, I hope that everybody will listen to this, and I know that it's going to be heavy because there are people that are in your life that you may not understand that are victims or going through something or maybe on the path towards something, and this is an episode that can help you see the warning signs, and that's what we're going to really focus on, are a lot of those milestones. So you, as a parent, a person out in the dating world, on either side, either male or female, what are some of the warning signs of slipping into this kind of relationship, and then how do you get out of it, and then how do you heal from it? And we're not going to discriminate. Not all domestic violence is men against women. Now, obviously, it's a large portion of it, but we'll talk a little bit.
A large part of what's reported.
Exactly right. Yeah, because men don't want to look weak, but I mean, you were telling me off air, as your work, you're kind of a person who is guiding them along that path, and you did a protective order for a man, for instance.
Yeah.
So a lot of your work is kind of shepherding people through that process who may be getting out of situations where they don't have access to resources. Is that a fair way to sum it up?
Absolutely. It's a lot of crisis intervention work too. Basically, how can I help you in this moment to get you safe?
Yeah. Right.
So how can we save your life at this moment, get you a protective order, get you into a shelter if needed, and then we'll work on, sort of all the other needs that they may have regarding to housing or paying off the medical bills that are a result of the crime, things like that.
Right. Okay. And then, Shaughnessy, what is your background? How did you get into this work, and what do you do now?
So I'm currently the Domestic Violence Sexual Assault Resource Prosecutor for the Indiana Prosecuting Attorneys Council, or IPAC. Prior to coming to IPAC, I was a deputy prosecutor for several years, where I focused on sex crimes with both adult and child victims, child abuse with serious bodily injury or death, domestic violence, and then for the last 2 years I was the human trafficking prosecutor. So I took all of the human trafficking cases in this county. And so what I do at IPAC is I travel across the state and I train law enforcement officers, prosecutors, probation officers. I don't know. That's how I met Layla, actually, was I was presenting somewhere and she was in the audience. So all kinds of different audiences, whomever wants any kind of training in those areas. To train sexual assault nurses a lot. So we do that. We work with the legislature to try to enact bills or laws that will benefit victims of crimes. From prosecutors around the state when they're in trial, things like that, to try to help them do better and provide a lot of trainings, trial advocacy courses, things like that.
Okay. So you work more with victims and you work more kind of with the infrastructure? Is that maybe?
I think it's fair to say.
Okay.
I'm not as much in the trenches as I used to be.
Okay. Is it just really hard work and you just can't?
It is not. I don't think I can put into words how difficult it is. There's something it's called vicarious trauma that is a real thing. It's not you're not the victim, and don't think that I'm saying that. But when you're working in that day in and day out, and you're seeing victims of these horrible crimes, you're seeing them after they've gone through the worst thing they've gone through in their lives, and you're trying to do right by them.
Right.
It takes a toll.
Yeah, I cried the other day to my husband. And I mean, I'm a tough broad. I mean, when you're in the criminal justice system, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, but it starts to have an impact, definitely. And it's something that I want to address with ICCVR. We need more programs addressing vicarious trauma with our colleagues in the criminal justice system, with prosecutors, law enforcement, victim advocates.
I think if you go into this line of work, you're probably an empathetic person to begin with.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And so if you're an empathetic person, I know I wouldn't.
You soak that all in.
I cry watching Netflix movies, actually. So Miranda, you've been a part of the program for a very long time. It's 2016. It's 2019 now. By my math, if I add the 3 and carry the 4, that's like 5 years. And so we've become close friends over a long time, and it's kind of dipped over time. And there's always
just the correspondence,
right?
Yeah,
the hearts are still there.
Exactly.
And you sort of go, man, I haven't heard from Miranda in a while. And you sort of like go, I hope she's okay. Let me check in. And then, every once in a while you check in, and like most of the time it's like really good. And then there's other times where it's like, I need help. And so we've talked a little bit about your podcast, on your podcast, Miranda's World. But let me give the summation of Miranda, because I want you all to know who Miranda is. Miranda is one of the most independent-minded, strong-willed women. When I think of feminists, I think of Miranda. Had a child at what age?
16.
16. Did it on her own, raised this child. She's about to graduate. Great girl. You've done a great job raising her. So you have a lot of strength. And you work with I don't know if you want to say what you do or if you want to. No? Okay. And you just you're very intuitive about people. And especially men and their intentions.
Well, with my past jobs, I've had to be. And also just being on my own since I was 17 with a child, and coming from a not so great upbringing with little support. My mother is a drug alcoholic, you name it.
Right.
Just very not a responsible person, not a great person. So it's crazy to think that I would end up in some of the situations I have in the past couple of years, because, the way I have survived this long and raised my daughter and did the things I've done is by being pretty savvy about people and reading into what's going on. And
right.
Yeah.
So I say that to just illustrate the fact that Miranda is not just like
a victim.
What are the, when people think of victims, there may be stereotypes, and they're probably usually wrong. What are some of those stereotypes that when people think of a victim of sexual or domestic violence, that the public may think one way, but the truth is another?
Yeah.
Weak, meek,
codependent, naive.
Yes.
And I not say I'm not
dressing a certain way.
Yeah. And not say I don't fall into those categories. I could have maybe been that way at one point in time or another, but in general, I would say I'm the opposite of all of those things.
Right.
And yet
You're
found
kind
myself
of,
in that.
You're a little terrifying, to be honest.
Well, I lost my bark for a while, so now I'm back.
So, go ahead.
Oh, and it was just, there's something that we kind of say in the world of victim advocacy in the criminal justice system, and maybe Shaughnessy, you've heard of this, it's called the perfect victim.
Does not exist.
Right.
Yeah. And so the perfect victim is normally portrayed by Hollywood and media and in the movies, where it's typically a woman walking down an alleyway, and they get violently raped at gunpoint, and they fight the offender off, and they act, all badass and tough, and that's just not reality at all. And unfortunately, our statutes are written kind of, I think, and maybe you can. Our definitions of rape are written sort of to support that perfect victim, when in reality, victims are everyday women and men and children, and they are usually victimized by somebody they might know and an acquaintance, and they really freeze when they're assaulted because they're surviving and they're surviving that moment. So I just wanted to touch on that about what victimization might look like.
I want to take a moment just to touch on partner rape, because I think when we think about rape or sexual violence, for instance, you think about that scenario in the movies, but the reality is that it is usually a person that's very close to you,
Not a stranger.
at all. And
it's not obvious and apparent what's happening
right
all of a sudden,
And there's a feeling, I think, if you're a victim, I would imagine that, well, I was in that situation, and it's just, I made that mistake of being in that situation.
That's
Guilt.
exactly right. And that, and these preconceived notions are what your jurors walk into the courtroom with. And I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit more later, but they think a victim has to look a certain way, and it does vary a little bit based on domestic versus sexual violence.
Right.
And if it's a what we would call a stranger rape versus an assault by a known assailant. And the vast majority of sexual assaults are by someone you know, not necessarily your intimate partner. A lot of them are intimate partners, but mostly by somebody you know and have welcomed or invited into your life in some manner. And that is a big part of why it becomes so difficult, because it's hard to wrap your mind around it.
Right. So I want to jump into Miranda's story, because let's start there and let's go back to, let's say, person 1 and person 2.
Okay.
Would that be fair?
Sure.
And anything you don't want to talk about, you'll tell me to shut up. But I don't.
Actually,
I see her
before we
over
go-
here, and she just looks so badass. You're such a strong woman. I can tell. She's
No,
ready to
thank
go.
you.
You're just a survivor. Yeah.
But before we get into the domestic violence aspect, since
Yeah.
we were talking about the rape or molestation issue, and then also part of my upbringing, we'll give you just a peek into what a shit show my mother was. And it's not about just downing her, because I'm sure we all have parents or people in our lives that, have exploited us or done things, and, it is what it is. But when I was, I don't know, maybe 12 or 13, my mother started giving me weed and Valium when I was 11. And it's because, obviously didn't know it then, I didn't ask for it, I didn't know. I was just a kid. But she had moved back in with my grandparents where I lived, and she wanted to do crack and do whatever she wanted, and basically get me A, out of her hair, but then B, kind of, and in a way, like a underhanded blackmail situation of like, I know I'm doing something wrong, so if I caught her, if I knew something, I wouldn't necessarily just go out and say it to my grandparents. So there was a guy that lived in our neighborhood. Again, who knows how old he was, obviously at least in his 20s. But he had, he's a drug dealer, obviously. He had like a big Tahoe with like TVs in it and blah, blah, blah. And so one day I was riding around with him smoking weed, and he forced me to perform oral sex on him. And I was really high. I was a kid, and I was just really high, and I was just like, I did say no, and I didn't want to do it, and he did make me, but yet he didn't put a gun to my head. There's just all these things. So when I got home, I just was very kind of confused and in a weird state, and my cousin, asked me what was going on. I ended up telling her. She's like, no, this isn't right. So she tells my grandmother. My grandmother calls the police.
make a report. My mother, at some point later, comes to me before like any kind of court date or anything, and tells me that, you know, she talked to her lawyer friend and it was going to cost a lot of money, and that I was going to get in trouble because I was smoking marijuana with this man. So I was going to get in trouble for that. And just all these other things, like, and told me to retract my statement because it was in my best interest. And so that's what I did. Because I had I just had no clue. And, you know, looking back, it's just like, wow. And that's because she was either buying or selling drugs to this guy. So who knows if he threatened her or if it was just in her own self-interest to do it. But, you know, just again, where it's like you victims feeling that shame or, you know, just not even knowing, like, it was just a very weird situation for me. First of all, I was doing something I shouldn't be doing. So there's that. And then there's also the fact of, you know, I was a wild teenager. So, you know, I don't know, just all these things that they pitted against, or she pretty much pitted against me in my own mind.
Right. So when you two hear that story, what I saw you shaking your head, Shaughnessy. Like, what was coming to your mind?
Well, actually, that behavior, that is abuse, what your mom did to you, and that method is something that we see abusers doing to their victims a lot of time, especially in domestic violence cases. In domestic violence, it's about power and control and keeping that power and control and the different ways by which you do that. Mm-hmm. And one of them is we see it a lot where they've done drugs together or something like that, and then they'll threaten their victim with, well, you know, we smoked crack together, and if you go forward with this, then I'm going to tell them that, and they're going to take your kids away. Yep. So it's the same concept for you. I mean, except worse as a child because it's your mother, mm-hmm. and she's threatening you.
Yeah.
And
so as somebody who's been in that, as a person who you worked as a prosecutor, correct?
Yes.
And so would she have gotten in trouble for smoking weed in that? Had she pushed the issue?
Absolutely not. She wouldn't have. But that's what people think all the time.
Right.
And in cases where we have lots of sexual assaults of commercial sex workers. And so I had one case, probably the case I'm the most proud of ever that I got a conviction on, was the rape of a prostitute who was a heroin addict, and she was out prostituting to get money for drugs. And she was honest about it, and she owned it from the second that she walked in the door, and because of that, we won. If she had come in and not been complete, because everybody knew what she was doing, like the mm-hmm. facts of that case were very clear. It was out in an abandoned house, and it was clear to anybody who knows anything what was going on. And if she lied about it, we would have been in trouble, but she didn't.
I mean, consent versus non-consent. I mean, even if you're doing illegal activities, a lack of consent is a problem.
Yeah. It's still rape.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But
I don't care who you are.
Sometimes even in your, like, the other person doesn't even have to say it to you or threaten you with it. It's like sometimes in your own mind, you know what you've done wrong, or, you know, and that's actually like a lot of reasons why my adult life, I have been pretty transparent with just about everything, because I never want to feel that burden for any reason, not necessarily a heavy issue like that. I don't want to feel that burden of what if the other shoe drops or somebody might have something on me. And that actually kind of will fit in, you know, we'll kind of get into some of that when we get into person number one and some of the things that happened.
I think it goes along with healing. I think, you know, my experience has been nothing like that, but just when you are 99% open, but you leave that 1% back, and there's always this, if people find out that 1% about me, that ugly piece of me, because nobody else in the world knows this. Like when you go to therapy and you talk about that 1%, all of a sudden nobody has power over you.
Exactly. And you can't give other people that power.
Right.
And that doesn't mean you have to tell everybody all of your business, but, and I try to tell my daughter try to instill in her the same thought, is that, you know, you need to, it's integrity. You need to be okay with your choices. It doesn't mean they're always right or good, but you need to know at the end of the day, you can stand up and say, yes, this happened, right or wrong, or whether you like it or not. It doesn't mean that's who I am now, but that did happen, and it is what it is.
Yeah.
And that, you know. it doesn't have any.
Yeah, and
Go ahead, Lo.
and I'm so sorry that you went through this.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to add that there is a hotline for victims and survivors of both sexual assault and domestic violence, and we can mention it through the podcast just in case anyone may be triggered. The hotline for any survivors of sexual violence is 1-800-656-4673, and you can call that number 24/7 if you need to talk to somebody. And I'm just hearing your story. It's heartbreaking because from the social science of things is that you were victimized by the crime by the man, but you're also victimized by the child abuse aspect of your mother. And internally, you're thinking as a young kid that this is my mother and she's supposed to protect me and she's supposed to believe me. And that's why we always say now we should always, believe victims and survivors. And so there must have been, maybe you felt like some sort of abandonment from the person that was supposed to protect you. And so that could be trauma.
But it wasn't really even until later because as a kid, you don't realize. I just thought what she said was what it was and
It's your normal.
moved on with my life. Yeah.
How old did you said, because you said 11 and
I
then
was 11 when she first started giving me drugs.
I see. Okay.
But I was probably 13, 14 when it happened. But, I honestly put myself in a lot of really bad positions. So the fact that was the only time that's ever happened to me is actually, I feel like a miracle in itself. I didn't have any supervision. My grandparents were really the only people that were disciplinarians. My grandpa died when I was 14. My grandmother, died right after 2 months after I had my daughter at 16. They were sick. They were, you know what I mean? And they did the very best they could. They raised me to be a great person. Like everything that is good about me is from them. But they also enabled her. And so that's, I was definitely victimized by her for quite some time. I don't speak to her anymore because I learned my lesson. I just can't do it. I refuse to be victimized and I can't have any level of relationship with her as that, but it's just kind of crazy to know that, it's like, it doesn't hit you until later in life, but it's like, oh, wow. Like that's what you did. Like, and especially having a child of my own, it's like, I could never imagine a situation, no matter what is in my best interest or not, where I would ever allow for that to go on.
I want to talk about the role of parents, for any parents that are listening who are involved in the community and may see or family members who are involved who weren't strong enough in that moment to rise to the occasion. I think there's the surviving R. Kelly. You think about the parents who got their child involved with R. Kelly, but we're strong enough to protect them. And so there's almost that one set of parents who thinks that they can protect the child, and then there's obviously Miranda's mom who is involved in trafficking or child selling, or maybe intentional or unintentional, and I think people think that particular story only takes place in very poor areas. But when you talk about parents who are on drugs and basically prostituting their kids, that is happening in this affluent area of Indianapolis where we're at.
And that is human trafficking.
Yes.
People, I think, often hear the term human trafficking, and it's a bit of a misnomer.
Right.
They think of the movie Taken or
African slaves.
Yes,
The
and
children
it's
being yeah.
I think that the statistic, and this may be an outdated one, but if it is, it's not too far outdated. I think 83% of sex trafficking victims in the United States are United States citizens, and the vast majority of those are our at-risk youth. It is teenagers, both boys and girls, but as we'll talk about more later, boys underreport even more than girls do. But you will see the same common themes amongst these abusers, whether it be sexual violence, human trafficker, domestic violence. They figure out what the vulnerability is, and they exploit it. And oftentimes it's financial stability and or love. And they figure out what that person needs, and they fill that void. And then, just like we talked about earlier before we were on air, it's not it's not day one where they're like, okay, a trafficker doesn't approach a victim and say, you're going to give 12 blowjobs today, and I'm going to take the money.
And I'm going to punch you in the face. They don't tell you that.
No, it doesn't work like that.
No, they buy you clothes. They make you feel good. It's all called grooming behavior.
Yeah. And I actually have seen a lot of that when I was a dancer previously. I was a dancer for a long period of time. And so you know, it's still, and for that situation, the girls that were involved in that, I mean, it's really a sad situation because if somebody else wasn't exploiting them, they were going to exploit themselves because those people, they had a drug problem. And again, a lot of times though, it starts with somebody that is somebody they trust, a boyfriend, a friend that gives them drugs to begin with. And it's all about that grooming because they know that this person is going to then be addicted and then they'll do this and this. And then eventually they're going to have that person filling a need for them, whether it's making them money or, you know, buying drugs from them or, you know, just however they plan on exploiting that person.
Let's talk about the concept of grooming. You hear about that maybe in terms of like you hear people who listen to the show may hear of like the grooming gangs and Islamic territory in London. But grooming happens all the time in both with children, with men or women in dating situations. Like, let's talk a little bit about that concept. What is grooming? What does it look like? How does it start? Because as we kind of talked about, as I've talked with a lot of my friends about this sort of stuff, it's like quicksand, but it's really slow sinking. And then 6 months, 9 months, a year in, it clicks. And then you realize you're trapped. So it really sounds like it starts grooming someone on the abuser and the abused. Sounds like it starts with a very, I don't want to say charismatic, but like to
manipulative
take
and sometimes charismatic.
Yeah, an exploitive person. Like we talked a little bit about Abducted in Plain Sight, where this person had a game plan, a very charismatic person who groomed the entire family to get to a certain point. And obviously that's an extreme case, but it sounds like it starts with a person who has the ability to identify the need of a victim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. So what grooming is it's getting them there. It's this process by which they use whatever means necessary to earn trust. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are like, oh, they just groom the victim, but they don't just groom the victim, typically speaking. They're grooming everyone around them too, especially in a child sexual abuse type of scenario, because that's what they have, I call it, they have mastered the art of manipulation, and they figure it out, and they become so trusted within that family, that community, by that child, that once it does come out, if it does come out, everyone's like, what? No, have you met him? He's the nicest guy. I mean, how many news stories have you watched? And people have come out of the woodwork, neighbors, community members, co-workers, whomever, and are like, absolutely not. He would never do it. If you think about Dr. Larry Nasser, how many years did he get away with what he did?
I think 20 at least.
It's multiple decades.
Yeah. So when we talk about some of those signs for people who are in that community or parents, what are some of the warning signs of that particular person, and then maybe that something might be happening? I mean, what are some of those first signs of trouble?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, just based on my experiences and some of the training, and I definitely want to thank Tracy McDaniel from Restored, who is the City of Indianapolis sort of human trafficking social work expert, and she works directly with the victims. And so I've had the opportunity to hear her speak, and she's great if you ever want to learn more and reach out to her. But from my experience, especially working in child welfare, and again, this is just my experience in child welfare, unfortunately, because a lot of these victims don't really have the parents that would kind of ask those questions and set boundaries and rules and curfews and things like that, just based on what I've seen. And so it's kind of that, I always talk about this sort of like, it's that social norm for people to say, well, it's the parents, and where are the parents? But, you know, when the parents are on drugs themselves, or oftentimes trafficking their own children, or are not around, those kids don't have anybody, you know. So
but there are a lot of, I mean, it leaks out of children. You have outcry witnesses because every child has a caretaker of some variety. Even if you don't have strong parents, you've got You've got
it's a community,
a
so
teacher
yeah,
or
neighbors, Boys and Girls Club, YMCA, yeah,
somebody. So if you're in those situations and you work with kids, like what are maybe some of those signs that you see in children that start to surface?
So they all of a sudden will have their nails done. They will have new clothes out of nowhere. Their hair is done.
This is human trafficking.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
And that's the same with even adults, because like I said, the dancers that I'm talking about, they're coming in with Louis Vuitton bags and they don't even have their own place to live.
Yeah.
They don't even have a car or a license.
So a groomer who is basically prostituting somebody, and that's the difference versus somebody who's molesting somebody. I mean, I want to make sure that we're kind of
it can all be the same.
So in trafficking, I mean, and our laws have changed, and maybe you can touch on this a little bit over the years, is that, well, first, depending on their age and consent and everything, but now I believe that all they used to be considered prostitutes, but now, those what is under the age of 18 are always now considered trafficking victims.
Okay.
Which is great news. I
Right.
mean, that is a huge improvement in our system.
Which
They're
has
not old
been
enough to give consent.
Which has
Right,
been a
yeah.
term shift, because you start to hear trafficking more, and you think like your child's being kidnapped and taken to the Middle East or to the Europe or something.
But it's happening right here on our streets in Indianapolis and around Indiana. I mean, all over our country.
It's very prevalent in Indianapolis.
Really?
Yeah. And also, I mean, and what Tracy was talking about is that this is mind blowing that some of these criminals, these abusers and rapists and what do you call them, pimps, I guess, are putting tracking devices in their victims, like the same tracking device you would go to put your when you go to the vet and take your dog, and you're like, yeah, I want to, what do they call it, like a track, like a monitor,
Like a chip.
A chip,
Yeah.
a chip. They're putting these things in their victims,
Right.
and so if they go to get help and they go to the hospital or they go to a neighbor's house, like what you're saying, they're too scared to
Right.
even say anything. And so a lot of the signs is that they're going to be, a lot of these kids are and that's why I commend Tracy so much for this direct service that she's doing, because these kids can be really combative and they're scared, or they don't know they're being victim, because, in their world, they've never had their nails done, and they've never had, somebody say that that's their boyfriend and they love them and this and that, and they may have already had childhood trauma and everything. And so they're being manipulated by the grooming practice, but at the same time, sort of scared for their life. And so there's a lot of behavioral signs to look for too. I mean, they're going to be combative. They're not going to want help sometimes, I think it's a challenging population to work with, especially, those kids. And just to add, I particularly, I don't work with kids or population, people under the age of 18.
Okay.
Just because it's such a in social work practice, it's such a specialized population, because it is so challenging. And hats off to all the social workers like Tracy that does that work.
And you've worked with that population, right?
Yeah, that's what I did for the last 2 years. So I'm actually only the second person in Indiana who's done those cases solely for any length of time. So I want to touch on that real quick. Not every parent of kids who's a victim are bad parents. It's easier to exploit a kid who's got some trouble going on at home, right? Whether it be inattentive parents or in the human trafficking vein. We had one mom who, she was trying her hardest. She was doing as best she could. She had 3 kids and she was working 3 jobs. And she sat down at her kitchen table and she said, you know what? I work 3 jobs and I can't pay the electricity. He takes her out and he gets her nails done and he gets her hair done. How am I supposed to compete with that?
I mean, you see that in Surviving R. Kelly, where the mom is gung ho to save her daughter, but how does she compete with R. Kelly and the wealth that he has and all? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
And in terms of human trafficking, often those victims have been sexually abused at some point in time. So for them, and I'm not saying that again, there's never any blanket anything with any of these cases. You can never say every victim has been a certain or has not been a certain way, but often they have been sexually abused. And for a girl who's 16 years old and her mom's boyfriend was raping her since she was 9, for her, just like Lael said, they don't identify as being a victim because they think, well, at least I'm getting something out of it now. And so for us, what we would try to do, because just like Lael said, people expect a perfect victim to walk into the courtroom. And especially a kid like that, who we have failed oftentimes for years because they didn't get the services that they should have gotten when they were getting abused at home, they do not present the way a juror wants them to present. They are not, they can be combative. They're rough around the edges, so to speak. And
They're not polished.
Exactly. And so it becomes really, really difficult to try those cases. And these cases, domestic, sexual, human trafficking, are, in my opinion, the most difficult cases to try. They're just really, really hard. And the grooming process in a sexual abuse case and a domestic violence case looks a little bit different than it does in a human trafficking case. Parents do traffic their kids, especially when there's drugs involved, and or maybe, and this happens in rural Indiana, in probably rural places everywhere, I guess, all the time. You've got maybe somebody who's got a drug debt for meth or heroin or whatever, and they're like, well, we'll just send our 14-year-old over there, make her do whatever, and then our debt is repaid. That is sex trafficking in Indiana,
and
by definition.
It's so sad. And just to add on that, I mean, I was looking at a recent article from 2018 that our country in the United States is rated number 10 for the most violent countries against women, next to India and Saudi Arabia, and I mean, and it's just, I mean, we're number 10, and it's because of all this we're talking about.
And it's not just that. I mean, and we'll kind of talk it as we go through Miranda's story here, but like when you hear 25%, a quarter of women have been a victim of molestation or rape or some sort of sexual violence, I don't buy 25%. Like
it's much more.
It's much more. I mean, there isn't a woman that I've ever come in contact with that doesn't have at least some very unsettling experience, if not all of them have lost their freedom at some intense moment in some way, or have felt out of control because of a boyfriend, a husband, like I will straight up punch a man if I hear wifely duties. Like if you ever listen to the show and use that phrase, you need to think about your behavior.
We love you so much.
I didn't realize that was a thing.
And men, though, as we were saying earlier, men fall victim to all of those
Absolutely,
same things. And that I'm sure for the Me Too movement, I'm sure, and again, whether they perceive it a certain way or will say that they perceived it a certain way, every man could say the same thing.
I mean, my husband has manly duties, but I mean, that's just because I don't know how to fix a car.
Right.
Yeah, everybody has their strong suits,
well,
but
I
it's
think,
demeaning someone.
I think Me
for
Too,
it.
and delving into this issue and having friends who have gone through it and talking to them about their experiences has been so great for me, because I just rewatched Married with Children, and I realized like how much of my view of masculinity and women and how much of it comes from that show. And
That's funny.
And so, sitting down with friends who have, or previous girlfriends who have said like, do you realize that this was a controlling behavior? This passive aggressive, like stop talking about the friend zone, like stuff like that. I think, it has helped me in that aspect. But let's go back to the people who want to help, or the people who know there's a situation going on because they can, they're a teacher, they're a daycare worker, they're a coach, a youth pastor, or somebody. They can see something is going on, but there's always that line where, should I get involved? What should I do? How do I see something how do I say something if I see something? Like, can you walk us through, if you're that person, when should you get involved, or when should you say something, or who should you say it to?
Well,
with trafficking specifically.
When certain people have statutory obligations. A teacher, if they suspect any kind of child abuse, and human trafficking is considered to be child abuse in the state of Indiana, they are required to report, right?
Right.
And actually, we're all mandatory reporters in Indiana at this point in time. So if we see something that we think is child abuse, now, if you see something that just seems a little bit weird, then you can't be like, well, I don't know, maybe I don't know that it's child abuse. But what I usually tell people is, if it doesn't pass the smell test, or you get that gut feeling, intuition is real. And if you get a feeling, I'm like, if you see something, just say something, because what's the worst case scenario?
Miranda said it best before, and my therapist always told me, because like my head and my heart always lie to me, but my gut is never wrong. Like that intuition, that human animal piece of us who says something's not right here, I need to do something about this.
Yeah, and
in every situation usually is right.
And definitely, and I wish I have all these hotlines. I wish I had the DCS hotline number. You definitely can Google DCS mandatory reporting for more information on that online. I believe, like Shaughnessy said, in Indiana, we're all mandatory reporters. I certainly am as a social worker, and I could even be prosecuted if I knew that abuse was happening and I didn't report it. And what I tell people is that you're not the investigator, right? I mean, you don't have, you can report anonymously. You just call that 1-800 number. You tell them what you know, and you did your duty, and they're going to be the ones to investigate it and find it unsubstantiated or substantiated. But you did your role, right? And it's required by law to report it. Now, oftentimes, I will say that the everyday citizen like yourself isn't going to really be prosecuted. I mean, you could be, but it's very unlikely. It's just people like me that know better.
Yeah, I think like
know?
it's not even the fear angle. It's the I don't want to get involved in this because I don't know if I should. I don't want to falsely accuse someone of something.
And like I said, they you're not falsely accusing anyone. You're just telling DCS what you know, and they're going to be the ones that investigate it and ultimately accuse.
Do you have a backup? Because I have dealt with DCS on several occasions and found them to be unbelievably incompetent. So is there a secondary way to kind of go about things? No offense, but just in my experience, I've found the DCS system to be like any other bureaucracy or government agency, just
I have too.
Flawed.
Yeah,
people who care deeply but have their hands tied by bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's also the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is 1-888-373-7888. But what's nice about that too is you can actually text them.
Yeah.
Awesome.
At 233-733. If it's a dangerous situation, you can text help or info, and they can try to get somebody out there right away. But what you do when you call them is they field the call, and then they channel it down to whomever the law enforcement officer is in your jurisdiction. So that's national.
People who generally deal in that local law enforcement with trafficking.
Exactly.
Thank you. That's
I think the
It's a good resource.
texting is actually really good because in this day and age that we live in, I think a lot of people have a hard time literizing what they actually want to say. So maybe they saw something and it's weird, but it's hard for them to like physically say it because if they don't know, or they just have all these other conflicting emotions with it. And we're just used to texting or emailing, and we don't have to actually have that voice to voice or face to face.
Calling DCS, I can tell you what parking lot I was sitting in, what the weather looked like. I can tell you everything about that moment because it was not a traumatic experience, but it was an emotional, gut-wrenching experience to call and talk about something that a 2-year-old told me about.
And it's hard. So I think texting gives you that time to like really kind of put out what you want to say, reread it. And so I think people probably would be more likely to use that than to physically call.
And my apologies, Lael, because you are on a libertarian podcast. So like my
Oh
anger,
yeah, no, I
anger,
get it. Listen, I get it. They're just my colleagues sometimes. So like
the next time I went in to give a report on the same situation, they had taken it, but nobody had read it clearly. I mean, it's so I think let's talk a little bit about that, because it seems like in some of these situations, several of my friends have had to be so dogged to get a police officer to pay attention. Or one friend in Mirandas Story, she had to have a deer camera with 197 photos to get out of the 20 police officers she went to, one finally took a report on it. I mean, it doesn't seem like...
Really?
Sorry, it's a whole situation. But I've had a lot of friends who go to law enforcement and they don't get the response. And maybe some of it is that it's such an emotional thing where like even the slightest brush off makes you go, never mind, because it is intense. But how dogged should we be about reporting some of these things? And if you get one bad officer who tells you something that's inappropriate, go to another.
That's when you call Lael Hill and I intervene and I can be a liaison.
Right.
Well, it's a victim advocate.
It's hard to find a Lael Hill in every
right. Yeah.
But how dogged should we be?
I think you have to be persistent, and I hate to say that need should ever arise, but I'm a realistic person, so I understand that it does. I can tell you what we do on our end in a training component is we are teaching our officers about trauma-informed forensic interview methods and believing victims, because there's victims. There is when a victim has gone through trauma, it affects their brain. It affects the way people remember things. It affects the way they present. We talk to juries about this. Have you ever laughed at a funeral, cried at a wedding? Things like that. People, your demeanor is going to be different, and grief, just as trauma, presents in different ways.
Right.
So if a victim doesn't present exactly like you think they should, that does not mean that they are lying. And so we're trying to do a better job of making sure that our officers, from the street officers to the detectives to anybody who's going to come in contact with our victims, understands this. And so we're all getting better at it, I think, and we're trying to do a better job of that.
I really do think that there is an increasing sensitivity to this issue, and I think the Me Too movement has really helped in a lot of ways. And things like surviving R. Kelly.
I think so too, and I was thrilled when all this first started happening. But we as a society are a certain way, and there comes a point when we start to get desensitized to it. And I think the pendulum swings the other way, and it's going to get to a point where people are sick of hearing about it. And I am not, and I don't want anybody to think that I am. And I want to hear victims reporting and coming out and standing up for themselves, but my focus is always on what's a juror going to see or think. And so I have to think about what's your average citizen who's going to come in and decide someone's guilt. What are they going to think about those things? And that stuff really does affect jurors, and especially even more now with social media. And we've seen politically what Facebook and Twitter and things like that, everybody's more in the know about things, but are they also kind of less in the know because there's so much misinformation that is...
Well, there's almost like a 2D quality to it. We talked in the last episode about porn and how, that robs you of intimacy, but you don't think about it because it's almost like 2D. It's like you're participating in it, but you're not participating in it. And so when you watch all the Netflix documentaries and you watch all the true crime shows, it almost starts to desensitize you a little bit. But I don't think you can ever discount sitting across from a Miranda telling the story and not have that emotion,
Absolutely.
So that's part of why we're doing this. Someone on the YouTube comments just said, "I agree. I went to the cops about my abusive ex-husband, told them he threatened to kill me, and the cop told me, quote, don't break up your family over that. No help with possible sexual child abuse either." And so it is a real problem with street officers, to be frank.
And this is a person that's commenting live. I'm so sorry that you went through that. I mean, what state are they out of?
I'm not sure.
And that's why it's so important to have a victims' rights organization like the Indiana Coalition for Crime Victims' Rights, because and actually, I got to look at our statutes, but because I think it just says the prosecutor and like the judicial members of the judicial system have to treat the victim with dignity and respect. But that's a clear violation.
Again, a libertarian podcast. Just because the law says something doesn't mean the cops are going to do it. But
right, but to add on that
Wisconsin.
Is that right? And so, but there, I hope that they have a grievance procedure for her, and I know that the Indianapolis IMPD does. And so, if a victim, needs to report a grievance such as that, they can go on IMPD's website and report that. I personally think that there should be an unbiased, separate organization like Indiana Coalition for Crime Victims' Rights. That's a nonprofit that's not affiliated, for them to file a grievance, because that way it's a separate. There's more trust there, right? I mean,
so let me ask this. So she's in Wisconsin, and so if you get a reaction like that from someone when you're trying to maybe raise a concern for yourself or others, should you go to maybe a separate organization that's outside of the system that can then maybe be an advocate? Would that be a good move?
I think it's really up to them. I mean, because there's so much control that's taken from them already, right? I mean, they didn't want to be a crime victim. They didn't ask to be abused and this and that. And so just and for me personally as a social worker, just giving them options and really not letting them direct where they want to go and how they want to see justice, and giving them the options and then supporting what those decisions are.
But how does a victim get to you is my question.
Through awesome podcasts like this.
Right. But if
there are a lot of marketing and media and things like that.
So I don't mean to make the prosecutor uncomfortable about my anti-police rants, but
well, I have something to add on that too. But
but if you're in that situation, from a prosecutor, like from a standpoint of prosecuting a case, is it problematic to go to an outside organization?
Well, first, it's really incredibly disheartening, obviously, for me to hear that because we believe victims.
Right.
And that is what we teach our officers. And I'm not saying that...
One,
I know this happens.
One bad apple.
Right.
But it's
versus
also
the 99.
what's
You know.
one person's personal beliefs. It's
Right.
like just, it's perception and it's, whatever.
You just
So
can't
that's
have an
what comes into it.
organization of
doesn't-
thousands of people and not have some people who don't have empathy. And
Exactly.
so I don't mean to paint all police officers that way, but I do think that this is a common thread. I mean, I've had a friend who said, "Why didn't you just shake your boobs until he was outside the window? Like, why don't you shake your boobs to keep him around longer?"
It is.
Like,
It's common,
That is
unfortunately.
so-
I hate saying that, but it is.
Is that
but-
could that have worked? Probably, sure.
But you
If you
shouldn't
saw
have
someone
to.
physically out your window. But the thing is, your mind doesn't work that way. When you're in a scared situation,
Right.
you don't think.
You're being hunted.
Exactly.
It's fight or flight.
Exactly.
They need to be held accountable and fired.
Yeah.
Right.
But
Well,
to answer your actual question, in Indiana, at least, we have the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault, and they will advocate for you.
Okay.
So if somebody
Amazing
were in that kind of situation, I would recommend here, at least locally or in the entire state, really, to call them. Every state has something like that, and they get federal funding, they get federal dollars to be in existence. So that would be a place to start. I mean, I know personally, it's just the way it works. I've had people in my personal life call me and say, "Hey, this happened. Can you help me?" And I
get
do. I make the call.
That's one thing that I've noticed about every area of government, and having been around it for almost 20 years. The most popular person in town is a guy named Abdul that we have on the program a lot, because Abdul knows everybody, and so if you can find that Sherpa who will get you to the right person,
Yeah.
and that's sort of the part of just how government and bureaucracy works. So my ultimate point to those listening is that if you run into one roadblock, don't back down and just ignore it. Go find other people. If you find one unempathetic person, there's going to be an organization in your city, town, state that is empathetic and will help you get the right resources and help you get out of a situation. And so if you run into those situations, don't stop fighting. Keep going. Find the people who can help you. And, I know it's difficult, but one bad response does not mean that you should stop, that you should end there.
Yeah, and are you familiar with 211?
I'm not.
It's called Connect to Help. So, and this is a nationwide number. So anywhere you're at, even if you're in a rural community, anybody can call 211 to get community resources and get some guidance on where to go when things like that happen.
Yeah.
But just to add on that, because I have to say this, because I am a huge supporter of law enforcement. And there are some bad apples but there's some good ones too. And
Absolutely.
I always use this agnology. I just made up a new word. I don't know if you heard
Analogy.
agnology, but that's a new one. So I'm acknowledging an analogy that I had.
We're breaking a lot of ground here.
So basically, when I worked in the restaurant industry, I just remember working so hard for so many people, and they would tell me that I gave them such good service, but they never mentioned it to my manager, right? But that one time, time I gave really terrible service to somebody. They went online. They told
That's
the
how reviews
corporation.
work. Yep.
Yeah, and so it's just like I do think that people generally respond more to negative feelings and emotions. It really lights the fuel, and provides fuel to the fire within their personalities and everything, because they want justice, and so they're more likely to discuss more of the injustices in society versus the good things, and I see that with media sometimes. I've known a lot of law enforcement officers that have done amazing things that the media doesn't really cover much. So
right, absolutely.
I just wanted to add that, because I can tell you, I mean, listen, I'll be the first to call out someone. Look, I just said they should be fired. But I'm also going to say too that we have some amazing law enforcement officers with IMPD here in the city that care tremendously about victims, and especially at the higher level with our captains and sergeants and things. And so I definitely recommend for people to try to get to them somehow if you can figure that out and get to them, because definitely the ones that are higher in command, they really care about victims. They have a lot of training. They've been doing this for 30 plus years, and I'm confident that they'll take care of the situation if they can somehow get into touch with those guys. So
So let's jump back to you unless you have something to say.
Well, it goes back to me with what I was getting ready to say is that when I was dealing with person number one, long before I knew anything for sure was even really wrong, I felt like something was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I had kind of tried to distance myself and it just wasn't working. But again, it wasn't anything up front, right? Like he wasn't just like up front, like I'm not going to leave you alone.
So let's kind of start back.
Okay.
Not to interrupt, but let's kind of go back to the beginning here. Like let's start at the beginning of the person one story.
Okay. I had known person one for about 3 years before I started dating him. I had gotten out of a long on and off relationship and was just kind of off the rails in a sense. Not anywhere near where I would go off the rails later, but just kind of like, doing just different things because obviously dating a certain type of guys or having a certain it hadn't gotten me anywhere, so I was just kind of branching out.
You were dating jerks, and then
you know what, after the last two people I've dated, that long 6-year relationship off and on, that guy was a damn angel.
Yeah,
honestly, he was an angel.
Person zero was actually
perfect.
It wasn't perfect.
Wasn't meant to be for us, but at the same time, nothing horrible like what I would deal with later. But the resentment that I had towards the relationship and just all of that, and just my own like empowerment of leaving that relationship, and I was doing pretty good in my life at that time, and was just like, I can do whatever I want to do, and so I had known person one, like I said, for a couple of years, and he always I knew that he liked me and stuff, but I just, for whatever reason, I really just couldn't even tell you why, but I just was always just kind of like, something about it just was like, no, not for you.
Sort of in your stronger moments.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's what led in. But then I ended up going to an event with him, and in my weaker moment, like, he just latched on. And where I was at in my life, I just tried to, again, make allowances for what was for the little things that were going on that were not in the norm for me. And that's because,
Can you give some detail to that?
Just, I don't know. Always saying yes. I mean, never, loved every single thing I did. I could do no wrong. Basically like my little sidekick.
You went from a guy who was
an independent person,
who was a little more there was friction, I would say, to somebody who was very,
we just lived our own separate lives, right. But this was somebody that was just all about me and just
quote unquote sweet, and
and literally all about me. And so I was just like, well, this is great. This is, like, oh, okay, this is fine.
Who doesn't want to be a queen?
He wasn't, I mean,
right?
He didn't, he wasn't like very successful. And like, the guy I dated before, he was very successful because he was very driven. Like, again, he just had different goals in life. Well, this guy's goal is to just consume people. Because I wasn't the first person that he's done it to. And so, he had 2 kids, my daughter was at a point, I never really wanted to date people that had children, especially when she was younger, because I just didn't want to deal with the baggage. I didn't have to deal with my daughter's dad. And so I just liked my life the way it was. I wanted it to be about my kid. I didn't want to have to deal with all the other little things. So I never dated people with kids. So this guy had 2 kids. He wasn't super successful. He was my age, and I've always dated people about 10 years older. And so all of the things that I just would never typically date in a guy, very scrawny.
Right. So, like, what was the attraction?
Physical. The attraction was just like, it seemed like he just got me, and like we had a lot in common, and so
Did you say mirroring
fun.
Behavior.
Exactly, and that's one of the times that we had spoken just as friends in the years previous. It hit me. I was just like, wow, this is so weird. Of like, is it weird that somebody would like be thinking the same exact way I think, or maybe it's just because I've always dated older guys. I don't know what the difference,
But mirroring behavior basically is just that.
And that's exactly what it was.
Somebody that reflects back to you your behavior, which is always kind of like your first sign that maybe something's not right.
Right,
here.
like they're like a chameleon. They become exactly who you are.
Right.
And I've had to kind of be a chameleon in a sense. So
but
I
let me
just try to
expand on
rationalize it from my own thought process.
Yeah, that mirroring behavior is a lack of their own identity.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That lack of self-sufficiency, that lack of a person that has found their own worth, their own life, their own strengths, weaknesses, that lack of a solid foundation and lack of integrity, basically integrating their inner life and their outer life into one thing leads to somebody, and this is, listen up everybody, everybody has this moment in their life, or they start out that way. I certainly did, where you start out where you don't really have much of your own identity, so you're trying to find it in other people or get your needs met by other people. And so that mirroring behavior is an act of, please like me, because I need you, because I don't like myself. And so that's always one of those first little warning signs that something's not right. They're maybe not a strong person. And so that mirroring behavior, I think, is a good warning sign.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Yeah, and
I mean,
I didn't know
wow,
that
Chris,
term, but that
you have
was
a
it.
background in social science.
No, I was just very fucked up. And I did 4 years of therapy and hard
Oh, okay.
time.
I was like, oh my goodness.
Twice a week I was
You
in there.
just taught me something. I'm like, wow.
Yeah. And so, because I had basically raised myself, I had to work through that sense of being a chameleon in my own terms. And so then I tried to be, I guess, understanding of somebody else or just whatever. Or then at that point, I was actually just kind of taken off. It's so strange because my intuition told me, well, that's kind of strange. That's not right. But then I was just like, well, you know what? That's because you're just an idiot, Miranda, and you don't have the right experiences, or you know what I mean?
Your own self-doubt.
I played myself, and I
Right.
used my own self-doubt against myself at that point. But then in turn, his mirroring behavior, that's what he would do all down the road.
And can you tell us how old you were around this time?
I was 31.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's so strange to me because, again,
You were also at a point, I think,
Not
where
naive.
you had kind of lost a lot of support systems, and that's one thing that if you have a lot of friends, like right now, I have a lot of friends who will tell me I'm being dumb. And so if you've got depression and you kind of isolate yourself and you lose a lot of those relationships that can be your guardrails, that when you have those self-doubts, I have a council of people I can go to. But I think at that point,
my support system was the guy that I had broken up with.
Yeah.
Most of my friends were his friends' girlfriends. So because I had been a single mom, and at that time, like I said, I was a dancer, so I didn't relate to my coworkers. I went to work and did my job, but just like, these people are crazy, would go home. And so I didn't have a lot of friends.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have a lot of family. And through the beginning of dating him, I only further distanced myself from the family that I had, because that was, he caused that, of course. And so he alienated me, again, with that whole mentality of playing against myself. Like, I had self-doubt about, my family and how they felt about me, or this and that. And he's just like, yeah, that you're absolutely right. That's not right that they feel that way or would treat you that way. And, he just further distanced me
Making
from
you
them.
dependent more on him and breaking you down
Exactly.
emotionally. And,
what are some ways that he would kind of try to isolate you?
Well, I mean, throughout the whole time, a lot of horrible things happened, and I didn't know that he was behind them. Some of the things I thought were just organic and happened. Some of the things I thought other people were doing to me. And the whole time, I was not in my right frame of mind because he was actually drugging me. So everything was, even more chaotic than it even was in my own mind. So looking back, the things that he, if I felt like somebody, had caused this or that to happen, he would only reinforce that. And then later when I would say, wait a minute, like, you know what I mean? And I would just kind of start to kind of get my grounding, like, this, what you're doing in this situation isn't right, or you have something to do with this or that maybe. And then he would say, well, no, you said yourself that it was this person, or this is what happened, or that.
Keeping track of all the chess pieces on the board and then playing them against you.
Yeah, but I've got a memory like nobody's business.
Yeah,
and
she
so
will fuck you up.
you might get the first time, you might just kind of have me bamboozled. And so I'll just say nothing because I'll start processing it in my mind.
Right.
But the second time you try it, bitch, please.
Right. So let's talk about some of that isolation and that kind of like tunneling you away from and pitting people against you. I mean, what are some other ways that you've seen that particular behavior, that isolation, that subtle moving you away from friends and family and disconnecting you from your support systems that might pit you against that person? This happens with men and women. Trust me, I've been with I've been in a lot of relationships with narcissists as a codependent, and that that has happened where you grow more codependent and you end up that person is feeding off of you and they isolate you. So like, what are some of those warning signs that if you're experiencing some of this, or if a loved one is kind of going through it, that you should watch, wow, this person hasn't texted me in a while, or other things that may be happening?
So the thing about domestic violence that people really have to remember is that it's not about anger. People are like, they just can't control their anger, and then there was this violent episode, or they lost their temper and they said these horrible things to me. No, it's about power and control, and having control over your intimate partner. And what Miranda was saying about isolationism, that's a big component of it. And what you said was so interesting, because he's amping you up and making you think it's your idea, and when you're in the moment, you don't even know it. And then you wake up one day and you're like, God, I haven't talked to my friend in 6 months. How did that even happen? And what you also said that he did is he was trying to gaslight you. And that's when they recall something to you that's completely different than what happened. And even the people who have the strongest confidence in themselves and their own memories, it does cause you to think twice. You're like, is that how that went down? And for somebody who doesn't have that confidence in their recall of events, maybe they're like, oh my gosh, I guess he's right. And then they start thinking they're crazy.
I've had, excuse me, I've had friendships where the friend is almost a little jealous, or there's something there, and so they're always just kind of keeping you off balance a little bit.
Exactly.
There's always just a little, planting a little seed of doubt, or just a little push in some
They
direction.
want to be your everything.
And then the second they're gone, you're like, why do I feel okay? And so I think in relationships, it's important to kind of notice that that person's like, I'm losing support. Or gaslighting, I think, is one of the most, it comes from a movie in the 30s or 40s where the lights are flickering, the gas lights are flickering, and the woman is in a domestic violence situation in this movie. And she's like, why are the lights flickering? And he's like, they're not flickering. And so it's literally like what she can see with her eyes, what she understands in her mind to be true, he is making her doubt, and she begins to doubt it.
I'm so impressed that you know the origin of that.
Oh, yeah.
He's educated me on some things, and I'm like, wow, I've been doing this for a long time. Yeah, it always reminds me of the Shaggy song, It Wasn't Me. I mean, because that's the same thing. She caught me on the counter, it wasn't me.
Yeah.
And I just caught you on the counter, and you're saying, but that happens. I think
did that a lot.
it's a psychological abuse. And Shaughnessy was talking about it's all about power and control. And in our community, in the domestic violence community, we have what's called the power and control wheel and the equality wheel. And definitely, if your listeners want to know about some of the warning signs, they can Google that. You just Google power and control wheel and equality wheel, and it'll pop right up. But the using isolation is on the wheel, and it says controlling. And I hate that this is gender neutral again, because there's a lot of women that are abusive and are abusers. So
especially mentally or emotionally.
Especially when it comes to power at power games, it may not be a physical thing, or there may not be sexual violence, but there is definitely it's a control thing because of their lack of self-esteem or self-worth.
I've been guilty of that myself, and in much more smaller minor ways. Like, I can look back and think about how I was aware of my actions and behaved a certain way to get a certain reaction. Or
listen up, if you're a parent to a teenager, think about all of our dating experiences when you don't understand the dynamics of power in a relationship and equality, or like, I think every parent ought to learn some of these. Google this and
power and control wheel and
explain it
wheel
to your kids.
And absolutely. And the Domestic Violence Network is an amazing resource here in Indianapolis that people can reach out. They do a lot of prevention and go into schools and talk about this. But the isolation piece, and I'm sure as you tell your story, because I can tell you that abusers, I mean, they all have the same MO. I mean, they all have. I mean, it's literally when I go over this power and control. Yeah, when I go over this power and control wheel with survivors, they're like, "Yep, that's him, that's him." And the isolation piece is, controlling what he or she does, who he or she sees and talks to, what he or she even reads, where he or she goes,
clothing.
Limiting outside involvement, using jealousy to justify actions, and I think
just
that's,
love you so much.
So that's the isolation piece
the
of that.
wheel, when you Google it, it's just an illustration that was developed to explain this to people because it makes it so easy. Because in the middle of the wheel, you have a hub, which is the power and control, and then the different spokes represent the methods by which people exert that power and control.
Yeah, so using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, minimize denying and blaming, using children, using male privilege, I'm offended, using economic abuse, using coercion and threats. Well, I mean, listen, using male privilege, I mean, obviously it's but the reality is there's plenty of I've been in situations where the female privilege has been used, and I don't mean sex.
And that's
it can be that, but it can be many things.
I can get on Tinder right now and find 5 new guys if you don't treat me a certain way. I think,
or I'm going to take your kids from you,
right,
and you will never see them again.
Things
like that.
That's ways.
And some of the stuff with person number 1, it's just funny. Like so something would happen. And again, I would have no idea that's even related to him. And of course it all was, but so something would happen and I would have one theory as to what happened. But I went through so much, and it's like, I'm an investigator. So it's like, I would try to figure out what's going on and, so I could fix the problem or just whatever. And so then, a little bit down the line, like I might come up with a new theory, and you'd say, well, but you already said that it was this or that. And because she's trying to shut me down from trying to figure out what's going on. And then person number 2, because I had been through all that, I did behave in the most craziest of ways, and I don't really make any apologies for it. Some of it I think was just I was going through a lot. Some of it because I was not in my right frame of mind due to being drugged with rat poison for a year.
Yeah. So there was a period of time where you thought maybe there was mold at work, or
I thought somebody from my job had poisoned me. I thought there was mold. I had no clue. And I went medical. I went to the doctors. I went to hospitals. And when I look back, he was always there. He, again, because of the tracking device on my car and because of the cloning of my phone, I was in, like, one day I woke up and I had this place on my face that had just erupted that day. I hadn't touched it. My lymph nodes were so swollen. And this is, months and months into the skin condition I had that I couldn't figure out.
Your face was kind of peeling.
My face was, I had just big, weird, like they're almost like cystic acne, but you would pop them and like this weird white stuff would come out. And I had perfect skin before that. And so all these things were happening. My hair wouldn't grow, my nails wouldn't grow, everything, and I had no clue what was going on. So I'm trying to figure it out so I can fix the problem. And that day that I went to the emergency room, I had already been to a dermatologist. I'd already done this. The dermatologist that he sent me to, and he went with me. So I'm in the parking lot of the ER, and he calls me. He's like, "What are you doing?" And we were broke up at the time, and but I was just like, it's almost like a Stockholm syndrome. I didn't realize I was a victim at the time, but at the same time, I felt bad for him, so I still talked to him and whatever. And so because I was like, oh God, he's so in love with me and I don't want anything to do. So I felt bad. And I was just like, yeah, well, I woke up, my lymph nodes are so swollen, I can't move my head and just this and that. And I'm going in. He's like, well, just wait, I'll come. And I'm like, look, I'm a grown woman. Like, I don't need you to come to the doctor with me. Like, I'm fine. And he insisted, and I still told him no, and he still showed up. And what happened, again, I was in a very agitated state.
You set a very clear boundary. You set a very clear no, and he violated that boundary.
But under the, guise of caring.
Right.
And so then I'm just like, oh, no, how shitty is my life that when somebody cares about me, this is my reaction, or I don't see it, or I think it's weird, or
I'm just being a dumb
or
girl.
It's intrusive. Exactly. And actually the few people that I had reached out to just in the months leading up to this event, I had reached out to my ex-boyfriend and then another guy that I had just dated for a short time, but also new person number 1. And I was crying and I had no clue what was going on. And I just was like, hey, I reached out to the only people that I even thought to reach out to, which were these 2 guys at 2 different times. And both of them literally told me that sounded like he actually cared about me, and I should just be thankful that I had a guy in my life that cared about me. I'm like, I can't get rid of this guy. Like, you don't understand. Like, and I'm like, all these things are happening, and I don't and I didn't know that they were him, but at the same time, I'm just like, all these things are happening, and then and this guy's just too much, and I can't get rid of him, and I don't know what to do. And they're like, well, you know, somebody that actually cares about you, you need to blah, blah, blah. And it's like, and
Somebody that actually cares about
and
you.
so
That's
I
what
get
they
off the
said.
phone, and I'm just mad because, you know, at the same time, I'm not weak-minded, so I get that they were asshats for saying that, and I get that that's really not. But then at the same time, I'm like, how shitty is my? It almost makes you want to give up. It's not because I think what they're saying is true, but because I'm just like, well, how shitty is my life that is people's perception that when something like this is going on, and that's their response to me. It's like, really? Because I knew well, even at that time, that was not the case.
Yeah.
Like, it didn't matter if he cared about me or not. If I'm crying and I'm just completely out of my mind, like going crazy and trying to tell you I don't understand what's happening and all these things, and then something's wrong.
Right.
And it doesn't matter if that person cared about me or not.
Right.
And so I go into the doctor and I explain everything. And by the time I tell the practitioner person all the stuff that's happened, the lady just very judgy. And again, my face is messed up. So people, like, I already feel bad. I already feel judged.
It was a very difficult time for you.
I mean, I contemplated suicide at least 3 times a day. Like, I would love to just come up with a solid plan of killing myself. Like, that was my thought every day.
Right.
And the lady, I can still remember putting in the information, and she's just like, are you always this like amped up or this anxious? I'm like, look at my damn face.
Yeah.
Would you not? What do you? Yeah, I'm excited. I have an issue, and it's been going on, and I feel like maybe something like this is flared up. Maybe we can figure out what's going on.
I think it's also, I want to interject here and apologize if I'm oversharing, but you would you'd just be in bed all the time. You just couldn't get out of bed.
I would lay in bed all
because you
day
were
and cry
depressed.
and just cry and cry and cry. He would come over to my house and crawl in bed with me and know that I contemplated suicide every day and tell me about how, you know, other people may not like me because of my face and this and that, but he would always be there for me.
Right.
And when he showed up, the actual doctor comes in. The doctor wouldn't touch me. They didn't test me for anything. They didn't do anything. He tells me that I need to go back to my dermatologist, and if she said it's cystic acne, then it's probably cystic acne.
It was not cystic acne. I mean,
Absolutely not. And also my lymph nodes were so swollen. Something was going on. Wouldn't touch me, wouldn't do anything. So I don't know what he said to them, but the bottom line is, and I found out later that he was telling people that I was on meth. If I was on drugs, shouldn't you be? And if I brought myself to the hospital, shouldn't you maybe just test me and maybe call the police? Maybe test me and say, ma'am, you're on drugs, like something. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't do they did nothing. He sent me away. And actually, I was so furious. Like, I just remember in my mind, like, I wanted to attack the man and just gnaw his face off. I did.
And let me bring in Shaughnessy and Lael. Like, is that an extreme case, or is that fairly, I mean, it sounds extreme, rat poison and all, but
I think that's fairly extreme.
yeah.
So
I mean, it manifests differently, right? So, some people, they're getting beaten regularly. You know, it looks, there, like we said before, there are some things that you're going to find in every single case, but no case is exactly alike either.
Right. You know, our friend on YouTube, my ex used to threaten to destroy my stuff if I was gone longer than 30 minutes. He'd demand, he would scream, he'd be waiting on the porch to scream at me, that extreme anger. Sometimes it's displayed like that. Sometimes it's a sneakier form like this. It presents as caring as opposed to anger.
Right. Well, he probably knew exactly, or he figured out what he could do to Miranda, because he knew that for her, he'd probably lose her if it was so blatant like that. But what he was doing,
exactly,
the abuse he was doing is he's inflicting this thing on her, and it's just further isolating her and trying to make her think, I'm the only one who could ever be here for you.
Yeah.
Let me share a personal story that I'm not proud of, because it's not nearly to that particular extreme. Hold on here. Restroom break. Because I want to show that it doesn't necessarily manifest itself in always in extreme cases. It can be in just a typical boyfriend-girlfriend relationship with one of the parties being unhealthy or both of the parties being unhealthy. I was in therapy pretty early on, and I had fortunately, this person had kind of pushed me into therapy, and I was just saying to my therapist, like, well, I don't want her to do that. Something that was good for her, something that was going to benefit her, something that was going to grow her as a person. I don't want her to do that. And she goes, why? I said, because if she does that thing, then she's going to get better, and then she's not going to like me because she'll be better than me. Essentially, she goes, "Did you just hear what came out of your mouth?" And I said, "I dislike myself so much that I want that person to not grow because I don't think I can grow or be a better person, and so therefore I want to keep them down." And I went, "That's the worst thing I've ever thought." You know, I mean, it was just a moment of realization where I did that work, where I think if you've listened to this program for any length of time, or Miranda can tell you as a close friend, like, I'm not the type of person who is an abusive person, or
Oh, not at all.
like when my ex-wife, you know, in your typical divorce squad, like, what happened? Well, he was abusive. Like 3 friends laughed in her face when she said it, just because I'm Winnie the Pooh. But like, I still had that in me because it was such a tremendous lack of self-worth and such a lack of my own identity that I had to, and I didn't want to do the work to get better because it was hard or scary. I wanted to keep my partners down because I didn't want to do the work, and it's easier just to abuse that, or to control, or to manipulate, or, you know, and I never got to that level. I never got to a level where I let it leak out of my head, but it was
not like
there.
You were doing it with that intention. You were
No.
doing a survival, or
From a
you know,
sickness, a
yeah,
place
exactly.
of a codependency and a, you know, basically adult children of alcoholic standpoint. Like, it's, but I think that's the root. That's got to be the root of it. I don't know about you guys, but or you ladies, what you might think, but I just see. I have a lot of empathy for victims of domestic violence, but I also look at the people that are the abusers, and you go, what happened in their life that they can't get this right? I mean, what are some common themes that you've seen in the people who perpetrate domestic or sexual violence?
I mean, I think you bring up a really good point, and one of the things that we teach young prosecutors who do these cases, specifically domestic violence, is that justice may look differently in a domestic violence case than it does in other cases. Because what's the end goal? The vast majority of victims in domestic violence cases either recant, minimize, or just don't show up, and that's for all of these reasons that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And I try to explain to them, you know, you're seeing, this is your job, but this is this person's life, and you've got to keep that in mind. And what is your victim's goal at the end of the day? They just don't want it to happen anymore.
They want them to go away. They want to stop the hunting.
They either want them to go away, or they just want them to get better because they still want to be with them, but they just don't want this happening. So I'm like, you have to take that into consideration and figure out how you're going to proceed with your case.
Yeah.
Is there programming that you can get that person into that perhaps will make it so that they don't do this anymore?
Yeah.
And the big thing, and I teach this to police officers as well, is that kids who come from homes where there is violence, or have you guys ever heard of the adverse childhood experiences scale? It's like 10 questions, I think, and if you're 4 or above, you are much more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system, either as a defendant or a victim. But it actually goes beyond that. You're much more likely. It's crazy because it's like health concerns that you wouldn't necessarily attribute to childhood trauma, but a lot of our offenders, both male and female, come from homes where it happened, and a lot of the victims come from homes where it happened. Now, again, I'm not saying every single one of them is that way, but
I think
it's
it repeats.
what you
It's
know.
cyclical. It's generational.
I think her preteen experience, I've heard from a lot of friends that, like, being molested or being abused at a younger age sets you up at a later point in your life for re-victimization in a different or similar way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Once
Too.
you're victimized, you're way more likely to be victimized again. Because people are like, oh, she clearly this didn't happen. She also this happened before. No, it's actually more
Yeah,
likely.
That's
Yeah.
so crazy.
And I, you know, when I meet with victims, especially of domestic violence, I really want to let them know that this is not their fault. This
Yeah.
has nothing to do with them. That these abusers were once children that were likely raised in observing family violence, and it goes back to I just had to pull it up because it's been years since I've studied any type of psychology, but Albert Bandura, if you guys have heard of him, he was the one with the Bobo clowns, and he developed what's called social learning theory about basically how children model the behaviors of the adults in their life. And so with this particular experiment, he had children observe adults, ones that were close in their life, punch the Bobo clowns, the clowns that would kind of fall over and pop back up. And then he had another group of kids that observed a different type of behavior, and then he put the kids in the room, and the kids that witnessed the violence with the Bobo clown also treated the Bobo clown in that manner. And so it's a learned behavior, and it starts at a young age, and I can't tell you how many times that when I've talked to survivors of domestic violence, that when I tell them that they were likely witnessed violence between their parents, they're like, yeah, he or she told me that they had a rough childhood. And you know, if you really want to get in the mental health aspect of it, they develop what's called in the mental health world access to personality disorders, which is, you know, your sociopaths, your narcissistic personality disorders, sometimes borderline personality disorder. Those all come out of child abuse and neglect and witnessing family violence. And so it really is a personality disorder in a lot of the profile of a lot of these abusers. And speaking of that, and I just wanted to add, because we mentioned, you had mentioned that you had contemplated suicide. So I definitely wanted to put that hotline on here. I think that's really important to note, because survivors, you didn't just survive the violence and the abuse, but you had to survive the PTSD and the trauma. And you know, there's, unfortunately, we just seen with the Parkland secondary survivors, 2 people that took their life.
Newton as well.
Yeah. And so I wanted to pull up that hotline for anybody that has dealt with trauma and has ever experienced suicidal ideation. There's help for you. There's definitely hope. Please call this number. It's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's 1-800-273-8255. That's 24/7. So you can call that anytime. So,
so I want, go ahead. Sorry. And then I'm going to segue into what we just wrote about.
Yeah. So just to jump into that, is the thing is with people, I don't have an answer to what I'm about to say because it's an issue. But, you know, when I was contemplating suicide every day, I mean, I knew there were resources out there. I didn't want them. I wanted to die. So that is, I guess, really what, you know, I guess it comes into, you know, having people in your life and noticing that with people in your life and just hanging in there with them because they aren't going to necessarily reach out when they're in that lowest place.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about my own struggles with suicide in the past, and for me, it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but as long as you're moving forward, that's what matters. Taking care of your emotional, physical, spiritual, mental life, you know, focusing on your social relationships, making sure you're getting exercise, going to the doctor, you know, if you need to learn how to get a therapist, all you can do is, if you have health insurance, go to your health insurance website and look for somebody that does cognitive behavioral therapy or talk therapy. Or it really wasn't that expensive for me to do it, but it was like personal training. You know, you'll spend money on a diet or you'll spend money on your physical life, but then you won't spend $30 a week to go to the therapist for a year. Which has taught me to be a better man. Has I think, if you go back and listen to this program 5 years between 5 years ago and now, it's night and day. So it's not hard, and there are a lot of resources out there. But I think a lot of it is just moving forward. If you're gonna, like, for me, the way that I crawl out of it, do one good thing for yourself a day and call it quits. Like, just start. Like, it's like, today I'm just going to eat under 2,000 calories because I'm not going to self-medicate with food, or I'm going to leave my debit card at home so I don't buy too many books on Amazon. Can you tell I had a problem?
Why are you not a social worker? I'm going to recruit you.
My phone would tell you that I am.
But you're absolutely right. That's actually, I mean, part of what, at some point I realized, you're not going to kill yourself. You don't have a good plan. And my luck, I'm just end up maiming myself and make things worse. So that was really my mindset. And so at some point I realized, like,
you don't have a choice.
You're not going to die. Yeah, you don't get to die now. That's unfortunately not in the cards for you. And so you need to start moving forward. And that was what I did. And, you know, this guy was so calculated and just, he's done this before, like I said. So like I said, he has 2 children they're twins with a girl. And she's out of her mind. Okay. Just like she would say things like I would, read the text messages and stuff. They don't make sense. Like she's crazy. And so I never, that was another thing that never quite sat with me. And I had even asked them, like, how did you have children with somebody that is clearly that out there? Oh, she used to be fine. And, he blamed it on after she had the children that this just happened. Well, since I had known him, she cannot live alone. She is now schizophrenic and she can never live on her own again. She'll either have to live with somebody or in a home. And it just blew my mind. I'm like, how does that happen overnight? But it happens overnight because he was poisoning her. I know that for a fact. I know that he did that to her. And
it's called drug-induced psychosis.
Exactly. And she has an irreversible psychosis.
This has a term?
Yeah.
It does.
She has an irreversible
Remember,
psychosis.
I have experience in mental health, too.
That's
So.
just unfortunate that some things have terms.
Some people can come back and some people have a fragile brain and just there's various circumstances and she was one of them. And now that I've been through what I've been through with him, I know for a fact he did it to her. But I also, going back to learned behavior, his mom had to have a kidney transplant 10 years before. And then as right at the end of my dealing with him, she was rehospitalized. And all of the symptoms that she was rehospitalized for, and I don't know how she is now or if it looked like she may never be able to like live out of the hospital at this point. And it was not related to her kidney that she had. But there was internal bleeding they couldn't identify, and they were all actually long-term effects of being poisoned with rat poisoning.
Wow.
And so I feel like this is not, and there was other behaviors from his dad that just, they struck me as weird with the whole thing. And I was like, wow, these are people that are college educated, and how could he be so naive about this or that? But it's because I feel like he probably did that to his mother as well.
I mean, Shaughnessy, going back to there's no perfect victim, like we're walking among successful people that may be engaged in this behavior. I mean, talk about...
Well, they are probably successful if they're smart enough to keep doing these things and get away with it.
Right.
Well, and that's a good point because it's the flip side too. There's no perfect victim, and then people look at a defendant, and if the defendant doesn't look the way that they think that they should look, this is majorly, oh my gosh, so prevalent in both sex crimes cases and domestic violence cases. They're like, he's so smart. I had a case where a guy was good looking. He had nice suits.
Brock Turner.
Yeah.
He was he was a smooth talker. He was a great guy because you have to remember with those jurors in a sex case or domestic violence case, you're not just putting the evidence in front of them. That's what you're supposed to be doing. And we tell them you are to look at the evidence only as it's presented and not be considering anything else. But it's just not true. It's their entire worldview that you're looking at. And if a guy like that could do this to her, then that could happen to me too. Yeah. And that is real hard for people to make that jump.
Yeah. No, I think, and I see that kind of when I mention, like, if you talk about Kavanaugh on your Facebook, you sort of start to see the same names popping up, and you go, I wonder what's up with that guy, or you're a little too aggressively defending this particular behavior, or I don't know. I just think there is it's a much more prevalent problem than people might think, and nobody wants to talk about it. And if you go on a date and he works at a Fortune 500 company, it doesn't guarantee that he's not an abuser. I mean, it's again, it's not. We're not playing to type.
Person number one was not very successful or anything, but again, part of like what kind of gave me a soft spot for him to begin with was, oh, well, you know what? He is a single dad raising these 2 boys. Got to deal with it's like, he's all, you need to just give him a chance. You just need to,
Right.
But it's like at the end of the day, he really wasn't those things he tried to portray himself as.
Yeah.
His parents had the boys most of the time. He really didn't have them very often.
Creating a mask that you
Exactly.
project.
It's a facade, and what is
Exactly.
it? So maybe for some people, it is Mr. Successful who's got the good job, who's gonna buy you nice bags and take you on nice vacations. Well, this guy, it was just a different facade, right?
Yeah.
It was, I'm a good dad, I'm a hard worker. You know I don't have a lot of fancy things, but I'm gonna take care of you.
I'm not like those other guys that you dated. I may not have those things, but I'm going to support you. I'm your biggest fan. I'm this, I'm that. Would never tell me no, even when, for instance, not last carb day, but the carb day before that, I literally got into a wet t-shirt contest where I was in nothing but basically my underwear on the back of a truck. And this is, again, part of it's because I had never gone wild like that in my youth because I had a kid to take care of, so I had to straighten up. But then part of it was, again, my mind not being in the right place. But I literally was like, here, hold my phone, my chair, and all my stuff that I've been carrying around all day. And I want you to record everything and he did it. Now, who would do that? And well, you know what I mean? People are pouring bottles of water at me and I'm twerking on the back of a truck in my underwear. But he would do it. But the thing is, just like all the other things he did, it's like he would never tell me no, but he would then behind the scenes try to do things to make them not happen. So, he acted like he was totally cool with my job, but then he was doing things that destroyed my face, which A, took me away from that job, but then B, also made me dependent on him. So it's like, more than one payoff.
I have only been to a workplace of that variety one time to see you, and he was weirdly okay with a lot of what was going on.
Oh, yeah. He would just act totally fine with anything and everything.
We'd talk about it, me and another guy, and we'd be like, there's something not right there. Like, you don't show up and watch, like, you walk out of the back room and you're like, how was it? That's just a weird freaking behavior, man.
And, there was just things that happened, even leading up to, like, just like small things that I, again, would never have guessed he had anything to do with. But again, he did. He was behind the scenes the whole time causing them. And that was friction at my workplace. It was this, it was that. And I used to smoke weed all the time. And so, and again, I was still even pretty headstrong. And so, I was honest. So at this point, I've already lost everything due to the depression and the stuff going on with my face and just whatever. And so I lost my apartment. I lost, a lot of stuff. And so, and he was always there to help me. I had moved in with a roommate. That didn't work out. So I ended up, coming to stay with him for a short time. Was the premise of me moving in there. My stuff was in storage. I had my clothes with me, my daughter, of course, and it was just, I hated his house. I hated that whole thing. Actually, even sucked more life out of me being there. But it just seemed like no matter what, I didn't even pay bills there or nothing, and I still could not ever get anywhere, get ahead. And because, I spent all my time in the gym because that was like my only safe place. And then, I would, what, I'm going to go either buy weed from this guy or I'm going to go smoke weed with this guy as my friend and da-da-da-da. And I would tell him, and obviously, with the tracking devices and everything else, he knew that's what was going on. And I would tell him that's what was going on. And yet he still felt he would never, the tracking devices never stopped. And he had one in my car at all times. He had two that he would switch out. He paid a monthly fee to have real-time GPS on them.
So there was a lot of stalking.
There was so,
too,
and
right?
I found out from somebody else that may have actually been going on before we even started dating. And before we started dating, I didn't even talk to him. He was my friend on Facebook. Like I said, I knew him for 3 years. I had no.
So he'd been plotting.
This is yes, and so this was very calculated, and so. I would just, and the thing is, that's what's even more crazy. Because again, when you try to wrap your mind around something, it's like, when you tell people like my ex-boyfriend had tracking devices and this and that, it's like, they probably think, well, you're not a trustworthy person. Well, the bottom line is I never did lie to him about any of the things I was doing. He was tracking me. He knew that I was telling the truth. And he still, the only reason I found the tracking devices is because instead of just pulling it out of my car for a day or two, because he would keep it in the wheel welding and somebody had sideswiped me. I was taking my car to be looked at. Instead of just taking it out until that was done for a day or two, he put it in the backseat headrest. And by the miracle chance of God, did I find it. And that was kind of the beginning of me understanding what was going on and getting away.
That seems like an extreme thing, but that sort of, let's talk about stalking. Let's talk about that tracking behavior, that needing to know where you're at, control where you're at, understand. Like, that seems to be a fairly common thing, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, how could you see signs of that if you were in that particular situation? Because I would guess you were totally unaware that this was taking place till you find it, right?
The sick thing is, I wasn't. I mean, I can remember when I still had my apartment, I had leased apartments there. I'd lived there for a long time. Then I leased apartments there, and then I just continued living there when I stopped working there. My apartment manager, and it's what's so crazy. The stuff with my face had just kind of begun happening. It was a couple months in probably. And my apartment manager came to me, and we were good friends, and he said like, "Hey, what's going on with you? Something's not right." And again, like most people, I think he assumed I was on drugs. Which is understandable. I get it. But, I literally pulled him into my kitchen and was like, and again, things were somewhat fine. I had kept telling person number one, like, you know what, this is too much. I need some space. But we were still on good terms. But I don't know. I just felt it, but yet it made me feel crazy.
It's just a million little moments.
I felt it, but it made me crazy.
Of doubting yourself.
Yeah.
Like in this story, you just sort of hear all these little moments of something's not right, and then you ignore it.
Yeah, all these like little things that would happen, or he would I felt like he knew something that I hadn't told him yet, and it was just like strange because not like I was hiding it, but how would he know before I could tell him? Just all these little things had happened, and so I kind of felt like these things were kind of going on. But then, when he came to my house to talk to me, I literally pulled him into my kitchen, was like whispering, like, "Hey, I don't know what's going on, but he can hear you. Like he has something in my apartment, and I know that he can hear us." And he was just kind of like, okay. And also that was more reason for me to get away from him, right? From his standpoint and from mine. But no matter what I did, I just couldn't seem to do that.
Yeah.
And so. And the thing, and that was just the beauty of it too, because obviously I was already having financial issues, and so that was the way he would get in, even when I would just say like, I need a break, I need space. Well, let me just come and get your car and fill it up with gas for you, because that's when he was switching out the tracking device. So he would do that at least once a week. Let me just bring you coffee, which I think the coffee is what he was. I think my Starbucks is what he was putting the poisoning in, and so just all these little things. But you come to find out, he did have a camera in my bedroom and the smoke detector. And even when I moved out of the apartment, so their smoke detector was beeping, and it was like, if you look up the code of beeps, it will tell you like there was a malfunction. And so I still remember like the thing was beeping, it was driving me crazy. And he was like, well, let me just change the battery. And I was like, look, because I told him I was calling maintenance out. He's like, let me change the battery. And I'm like, it's not the battery. And I'd get really irritated because I just was like, this dude's a fucking idiot. And so he's like, well, just let me try. And I'm like, person number one, you're a fucking dumbass. It's not the battery. I just showed you. I Googled it. It's a malfunction with the thing, blah, blah, blah. Well, he got my little stump ladder, and he got up there. And, of course, he annoyed the shit out of me. I didn't sit there and watch him. I went about my day in my apartment and did whatever. Well, when maintenance came out to finally fix it, I just remember the look on his face. He was like, I have never seen the wiring so messed up in one of these. And that was after, person number one had gotten up in there and tinkered and obviously removed whatever he was doing.
So for the sake of time, let's start kind of winding it down a little bit. But I think it's important to talk about how you got away from him.
I got away from him because all the things that he was doing, like I said, with, causing me to lose my job, he confronted me about being worried about my drug problem one of the nights that I was leaving to go either hang out with. And again, my drug problem was weed. And I understand that for some people that knew me at the time, my face was crazy, whatever. And it's like, they might have thought like, oh, but that literally was my only drug. I have never done meth. I have never done hardcore drugs. And
like your behavior was over the top. And like, I didn't know you really before
right.
But so I just assumed you were an over the top person. But
and I am. But that was heightened for me.
Right. But it wasn't ever way out of the realm of insanity, or like, it wasn't, like you were just different than me, or the way that, I lived my life like in a cocoon, but you weren't, you could just tell like something was off, but it wasn't drugs. It was,
right.
It was literally,
and I just thought it was like maybe that mental place in my life, because I had been so conservative for so long, but as my daughter was getting older.
But do you think he was kind of pushing you to?
But he did, yeah, he pushed me to that. And some of it was the drug induced state that I was in, but then some of it was just like the thing at the track, like I tried to get away from. I wanted them to go away. I would have been totally fine if he would have just left my stuff and left me there.
Do you think that he was pushing you to self-destructive behavior?
Yes,
right.
Just to cause me to need him, but then to also keep other people away.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, I was exactly where I told him I was going to be, getting actually getting some money from a guy for my phone that I had just bought some weed from. And it was just, again, just some like young kid, like 24 or something. I met him in front of the casino one morning. And then the police pulled up behind me, and the cop got out. My license was suspended. It shouldn't have been. It was an error with State Farm. I was like, "Oh, wait a minute, we can." And he was like, "Nope, I smell marijuana. Get out of the car." And so it was, an issue with insurance not being. They didn't do their part. So that was corrected. No big deal. But the guy that I was with, there was a Xanax. He claimed it was his in the police report. I still, we both went to jail. Okay, so then this anonymous disturbance was called in, which is what the cop said. There was an anonymous disturbance reported. Well, I just thought this guy had maybe acted a fool in the casino. I had no clue. I never got out of my car. I was in front of the door at the casino the whole time. I'm like, I don't have a part in that. He's like, well, I smell the weed, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Long story short, I ended up going to jail. My first time ever in trouble. So while I'm there, what I didn't know, because they hadn't booked me in yet, is I had enough cash to just bond myself out. But you don't know people's numbers these days. Well, as I'm there, all of a sudden they're like, I'm like, there's a window, and I'm like, I thought I saw person.
You already know what's about to come out. Yeah.
I thought I saw person number one's car.
Shaunesty's like,
and I'm like,
of course,
That's weird.
Mr. Knight in shining armor shows up.
Weird.
Imagine that.
And then they're like, yeah.
How did
Barnett,
he was
up,
45 minutes? He was 45 minutes away where he lived, and he was there. It was amazing. Maybe just.
Well, he waited a few hours, and but still, I never called him. He showed up and bonded me out of jail, and so. Again, it's like there's so many emotions. Like, you know what I mean? I've been through all this whole traumatic thing. I'm tired, but then I'm also relieved to be out of it. But then I was like, how did you come to get me? Like, I didn't even call you. He was like, when you didn't come back, I knew where you were at, where you said you were going to be. And so I looked it up online. But the thing is, they didn't even book me in until he bonded me out. So I wasn't online. But again, that I didn't know at the time. So I'm just like, well, that's crazy. And so it wasn't until finding the tracking device in my car as I was preparing to, try to get away from him, that then things start making sense. And so
Space seems to be the thing that kind of helps you put it all together, is it not?
Yeah, for sure. Time and space.
Yeah, getting away from them, because then it's like you have time to stop being gaslighted and start putting things together. And
so when your girlfriends or friends of any nature say, delete them out of your phone, delete them off of Instagram, delete them off of like social media, I think just those steps, block him on your number, like those little things, that's hugely important.
Get a protective order.
Yeah. Well, I was denied.
Oh gosh,
I was denied one. And so what would happen? And we can get to that too. And I get it. But so what then would happen was I found the tracking device in my car, just this, and I start putting things together. And so I didn't care at that point. I'm just like, I'm getting away. I got to get out of this guy's house, or I'm gonna die. I don't even know. And so. I knew a guy who was looking for a roommate, and I'm like, that's perfect, like, blah, blah, blah. Well, again, this stuff's been going on my phone, and I felt like he had something on my phone, but I'm like, oh, no, surely I'm crazy. No, he had my phone cloned, and so he knew everything that was going on my phone. And again, he was very good, though, because he would just say things, and I like, maybe they happened 3 months ago, but I know that it was like a message I had sent or an email, and I'm like, how the hell would he know word for word? But he wouldn't say like, oh, I know this happened. He would just say it in a different, like, use it in a different context just to kind of mess with me.
Yeah.
Just to mess with me.
Totally memorized it. Just
exactly.
Most of it, yeah.
Just it's like that. It's a psycho. He was just a total psycho. Yeah. And so he would do those little things where he kind of got off on the fact of kind of rubbing it in my face, and then I have no clue. So I literally was texting with the guy, my best friend since I was 18, her now 20 or then 21-year-old daughter overdosed on heroin and died. So happened to be that same next day was when I went over and signed a month-to-month lease, and I had been talking about doing that with him on my phone. And I knew he could read my phone. At this point, I already kind of knew that, but I just was like, fuck you, I don't care. Like, you know what? I hope you do see this, because I'm fucking getting away from you. And when I got arrested the first time, I got put on probation. I was still smoking weed. I was using fake urine, and so he told on me for that. And so then I went to jail, and then this time I had to go for 2 weeks because I was on probation, so it's a probation hold. And so, but as I sat there for 2 weeks, my face started healing. All these other things are, and I knew as soon as it happened, it was no coincidence. I knew when I went in that I knew that he was the reason I had gotten called in for a drug test that day. I just knew it. And I could tell by the way everyone was looking at me. I could tell by the way he looked at me when I left his house. I could just tell everything. And it still happened. It played out exactly as I had expected. And I went to jail for 2 weeks. And so that whole 2 weeks, all my clothes are there. I cried to the lady that ran the jail. I'm like, this guy did all this to me. I'm like, I understand I'm guilty of what I'm here for. But what's going to happen? I'm like, is he going to get rid of my stuff? And so I was just freaking out. And so the whole 2 weeks I had to just kind of play it cool and act like I think he was behind it all. And so then it hit me that he was behind the first thing. You know what I mean? It starts really kind of coming into context. And so when I got out, I almost killed him. I wanted to. I packed my stuff up and I left. Excuse me. And he obviously wouldn't take accountability that he had been behind all of it. He would just try to, like, only the things that he knew I knew for sure about, like, and then it was just he tried to downplay it. And so I was just like, look, I'm not doing this with you. I don't care. I'm out. Well, while I was in jail, he came and got my car, and I didn't want to sign it over to him, but what am I going to do? I was just like, well, I have to, because otherwise I don't have to, but is that or pay the tow and then, you know what I mean, all that stuff. And so I was just like, screw it. Well, while I was in there, he had another tracking device hardwired into my car. So once I got out, got my stuff, got, everything, I made a police report. I let them know, like, this is the extent of, like, what he's done. Like, I understand I broke the law. I'm not trying to say that, but he went through all of these measures to try to control me or try to do this and that. And I showed him the tracking device, this and that. And so I went to Prevail the next day, and they were wonderful, but my protective orders were denied because he had not physically abused me. He had not threatened to physically abuse me.
How is that possible?
That is the law in the state of Indiana. You cannot get one unless they work a little bit differently than that, but for the most part, that's exactly it. And
so you can only get a protective order if there's a threat of physical violence or physical violence.
Yeah, there's 3 areas. That covers you have to write an incident where you were placed in fear of physical harm. He threatened physical harm. He did cause physical harm. Stuff like that. So it's all physical, like Shaughnessy said. Yeah. And then there's the second component that you can get protective order, all in the sexual violence, rape victims and things like that. And then there's the third one, which is stalking. But stalking's really hard to prove in Indiana, and it's really hard to get a protective order on. I've only been successful with one.
That was what, and that's what the cop told me when he took the police report. He told me, like, I don't doubt what you're saying.
Poisoning your...
But you can't prove it at that point, because now this time has passed, and I can't prove that he did it. I mean, I didn't even know what was going on at the time, so I can't go back and say, well, now I know it was him,
So is there just a huge set of holes in the laws that are written by the state legislature or cities in their statutes?
There are tons of gaps in the law when it comes to protecting victims. And we, every year, as part of what we do, is we lobby and we try to help laws to help write laws to bridge those gaps. And then we, some of the things we come up with, that's what, my agency does. This year we got a comprehensive victim rights package through Senate Bill 551. It's looking good.
Love it. Check it out. Senate Bill 551.
Lots of good stuff in there, including actually protective orders for victims of grooming. So we had and I don't want to take away from what you're saying because I really want to hear more about that. But there was a situation where a child was being groomed by her friend's dad, and it was like really creepy stuff, like seeing her tons of text messages, like 1,000 text messages in a relatively short period of time. Sent her roses on Valentine's Day. She was getting ready to go on vacation with this other kid and her family with the perpetrator, and had the parents not realized what was going on, then they were about to send her out of state with this family because he was so and so's dad, good guy, and so they came to us and wanted to criminalize grooming behavior, and we were like, you can't. There's no way of doing that. We can't do that. But what they did is they amended the protective order statute now. So if a person comes in and says they feel like their child is being groomed, that they can get it now. So
why can't you pass laws against that? Like when you say you can't criminalize that behavior, why
if
not?
you think about it, how would we write it that would make where it would still be constitutional, and not a case where
so you can't criminalize being a creep.
Exactly.
Every listener to the Libertarian podcast just sighed a breath of relief, right, Miranda?
Right.
Exactly.
Well, because that's a matter of perception. So what
Sure.
because it's hard to draw a line.
Can I
with
not
some
be
of
nice
those
to a
things.
kid? You know what I
it's
mean?
hard
Right.
to draw that line because what's weird to you and what weird, to her, to me, it's all going to be different.
Yeah, it makes total sense. So if there's tons of gaps in the laws and police are like, because that's what happened with Amanda. If you listen to Amanda's story, there's a lot of people who are like, this is terrible. I feel bad for you. I wish there was anything I could do. Maybe you can go talk to these people. And she'd go talk to that person. This is terrible. I wish there were anything I could do for you. Maybe go talk to the prosecutor. And then it's just this never-ending cycle from the state, the city, any government institution. So if you're in this kind of situation where you clearly know, like, what other resources might there be? I mean, and realizing this is a national show, so try to be a little broad with it. But
well, in that exact scenario that I just described, go to your legislator. Sometimes it does work. In that situation, they actually reached out to us. We contacted the prosecutor in that jurisdiction who contacted the senator, and then we all got together and we're like, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
And we did something, and the mom of that child came and testified during committee this year. Revenge porn. Have you guys heard of what revenge porn is? We've been trying for years to get something in revenge porn passed, and there's one particular victim of it whose ex-husband kept disseminating intimate images of her without her consent after they got divorced, and he keeps doing it. Like, he does it over and over, and we can't do anything about it. There is no law on the books, and she went to the mayor of her town, and they are there every year, and we've been there every year trying to get it passed, and we actually think we might get it done this year. So no promises, because you never know until it's written.
And this is why I love the Prosecuting Attorneys Council and IPAC and just such great prosecutors that act as a resource for not just us advocates and prosecutors, but also for victims. I mean, they are such great advocates in that sense. And I agree. And actually, ICCVR, I mean, one thing that we're going to be doing is really coaching victims and survivors on how to talk to their legislators and how to be lobbyists. And I've done some lobbying, and I can tell you, I don't do the direct lobbying. I believe that it's much more impactful for survivors to do it, and it's really healing for them too. And I can tell you that some of the best laws in our country that have been passed to protect the public were lobbied by crime victims.
The reality is that it's an overwhelming task, and you've got 150 legislators that you have to convince and a governor, and it is an overwhelming task of endless meetings. It's hard for people to take off work to go have those conversations. But if we're not getting the government that I would like to design at this point. This is the government we have, and there's children that are being hurt now. There's women that are being hurt now. There's men being hurt now, and you have to rise to the occasion. If you're interested in helping with some of this stuff, you have to be an advocate, write the people that are that represent you to support Senate Bill 551, things like that, and you have to go step up. I mean, that really is
take action.
People have to have personal conversations with legislators, and one thing that I try to do with the show is humanize the people that are involved in government. Like, obviously, Shaughnessy has come here today to talk to people that, like, in the abstract, like, oh, prosecutors or but in reality, you're somebody who deeply cares about the people that you work with and getting justice for victims.
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard. And, it's easy for other people to armchair quarterback the things that we do. And we get
Right.
a lot of crap in the media and things like attacking plea agreements and things like that. But I just encourage people to think about everything we've talked about tonight and all of the factors that we have to consider when we're going into court, because I'm trying my damnedest not to put my victim through any more than they've already been through, because I've had multiple victims tell me that going through the system was harder than what they had been through already.
Yeah.
And unless you have had to hold a victim of a rape or a molest or domestic violence after a jury has found their offender not guilty, you don't get it. And so I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that they don't go through that.
Can you talk about being a victim on the stand? We mentioned
my
it off
God.
air, but I think it should be on air.
So Leah was talking earlier about victims' rights, and I'm talking specifically about Indiana. It is constitutionally written. I think it's Article 1, Section 13. Don't quote me on that.
Don't worry.
And then it's statutorily prescribed.
We're not going to argue with you. We're not lawyers.
Right, yeah.
But it's treating victims are supposed to be treated with fairness and dignity. And there's these whole list of things that they're supposed to be given, these rights and these respects. And there is one major caveat, and that is unless it infringes upon the rights of the accused. And anybody who has ever seen a victim sit through a cross-examination on a stand in a court of law would say, excuse me, where's the fairness and dignity? And then, the defense says, well, this is zealous advocacy on the behalf of my client, and I'm going to do what I have to do.
Right.
And some of the things, and sitting there at the prosecutor's table, there's only so much I can do, because they do have that right. They have the right to cross-examination. That is a constitutional right.
Right.
But it's really hard to watch it when you know what your victim's already been through. And if you've got a skilled defense attorney, they know the preconceived notions that we talked about earlier on behalf of the jurors, and
And
know
they're
exactly
very good at what they
know how to
do.
get that
they,
response.
yeah, they know how to question the victim in a way that plays on those notions that your jury's already thinking of.
Right.
And so they're really, really difficult cases.
They are, and and that's one thing that we can do as advocates is really educate our clients and survivors on the realities of the criminal justice system and not sugarcoat anything. I mean, I'm completely honest with them about the probability of a conviction, especially in sexual violence cases. I mean, statistically, out of every 1,000 rapists, only 5 are going to see prison time. I mean, it's like 3%.
Believable.
And a lot of it's for what Shaughnessy was talking about, and so it's like I have to prepare them for that and testimony and things like that. But also, I'll tell you, I hate the word plea deal. I hate the word. I think it should be called plea negotiations. It's really not what the victims and survivors think. Or not. But it just sounds kind of bad. It really is that, like Shaughnessy was saying, is that, you want to really avoid a trial, and sometimes plea deals can be a good thing. And if we can somehow explain to victims and survivors what that entails and what aggravating circumstances are that the prosecutor is going to argue, and what mitigating circumstances are that the defense is going to argue, and the fact that I tell victims all the time, do not ever underestimate the power of a defense attorney, because they are really good and they are good at what they do. And I've seen them perform in court, and it's Shaughnessy, I'm sure you can talk about it. I mean, it's a game. It's kind of like you guys are dancing in front of the jury. And so for a victim and survivor, I mean, this happened to them. There's no, oh, we need a jury. Like this happened. And so, so they don't understand the, what do you call the
process
proving beyond a reasonable
Standard of
doubt.
proof.
Yeah.
It's a strict and heavy burden.
The heavy burden, the fact that you have to convince jurors what they have to have, like, be 99% sure that person's guilty.
I would never describe it like that, but just reasonable doubt it's kind of a tough concept too,
Right.
like for the average person, for lawyers to understand. But yeah, having those conversations with your victim is never easy, because the way I would talk to my victims is, you are my number one concern, period.
Right.
But you have to understand my number 2 concern is the next person. And so I've got to do everything I can to make sure this isn't going to happen again to somebody else. And so if we're going to plead this a different way, then I would like to plead it, but I know that this person will sign that, and it's going to put them on the sex offender registry. And so I can try to say the next person, I want to do that. And I never, ever set high expectations for these cases,
Right.
because you simply can't. I have seen cases that I was like, oh, this is a slam dunk. and we lost him. I've seen other cases where I'm like, because if you're doing this job right, you lose sometimes, period.
Yeah.
Because there are some times where it's not a strong case, but I think I might be able to prove it. And I know in my heart, I believe my victim, and I know that that person did that. I'm going.
Yeah.
All day long, I'm going to go. And
To
I'm
trial,
gonna,
when you say you're going to trial. Mhm.
You got to do it. And sometimes you're going to lose. That's just the way it is, because you got to do right by that person and by your community, because that's the whole point. That's what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. I'm going to start wrapping up because you two have been more than you three have been more than generous with your time, and I know it's getting late. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask about, like, not the Kavanaugh situation specifically, but when we were going through that as a country and people are questioning Blasey Ford's credibility. I think she's a bad example because I have issues with some of kind of a lot of that. But I found her to be a credible person when she was testifying, but I also found him to be credible. So it's a tough thing. So I don't want to get into the weeds of Kavanaugh specifically. But in that kind of time period, there were a lot of moments where victims were stepping up, or R. Kelly's victims are stepping up, or, you know, we're having people step up in public and saying, Bill Cosby sexually assaulted me, or this person sexually assaulted me. Working with people on a daily basis like you do, when you see some of these things, are you able to discern who is telling the truth and who is not? Or how do you personally kind of work through, like, a Kavanaugh accusation, false accusations? I mean, I've had them in my life. I mean, it happens,
unfortunately.
If you have an interpersonal relationship that fails, it's a very easy way to kind of, I mean, so I'm sensitive to that side too, but the reality is that sexual assault happens and people who are in prominent positions may have done things 20 years ago. So how do you discern or separate, if you're going to give some advice to the listener on how they ought to look at these cases in public, how would you do that?
Well, I think the Kavanaugh example is really difficult because you have the added factor of politics in it.
You have the force of government
and
behind that.
So it's very hard on that one because I think that some people on both sides, a lot of people went into that and they've already got a foregone conclusion.
Right.
And then they fit the narrative to whatever it is that they've already concluded, in my opinion. Generally speaking, in my career, we talked a little bit about false accusations. The rate of that is actually really low.
Yeah.
And they don't get to me usually.
Right.
Because they've already been through a screening process. You know, the detective's already been there. Another prosecutor has decided whether or not there's probable cause to file the case. So by the time it gets to at least
specifically a false accusation of rape.
Right, that's what I'm talking about.
Okay. Right.
And in the entire time I did these cases, there was only one where I was like, I don't think that happened the way that they said that's happened. And I dismissed it because ethically that's my duty to do so. My duty is not to get a conviction. My duty is to make sure that the right things are happening.
Justice
right?
is permitted.
Yeah. Exactly. So for me, when I look at some of these things in the news and stuff like that, first of all, when you have multiple people who are saying the same exact thing happened to them,
right.
They don't know each other. I mean, the proof's kind of in the pudding there, in my opinion.
That's
Roy Moore.
That's been my standard. I think, multiple accusers were like the George Takei one, where it was like one guy and he was kind of okay with it. And it was like, oh, it's fun. And then nobody else comes forward and you're like, this seems like bull crap. But then you have Roy Moore, where there's the same pattern in a lot of these stories. It's like
some of the girls may be lying. It may have, if out of 10 people, maybe 1 or 2 of them are embellishing or just whatever. But yeah, if you have multiple people coming up and saying something, there's something there.
Right.
Yeah, and Shaughnessy had mentioned being how those of we're what's called trauma informed, and I definitely encourage your listeners to Google that term, and to also look at the term. There's a whole science behind victimization. Looking up the term, the neurobiology of trauma. So I'm really biased. I've gotten a lot of training in this field and training on the neurobiology of trauma, and the science behind it. And so when I hear people say, "Oh, she had gaps in her story." I mean, I know that happens. I mean, that's what happens when you're victimized and traumatized. And so, to me, in my opinion, well, first of all, I have to. I mean, I believe I mean, I believe it. I'm an advocate, and I would not be a good advocate if I didn't believe Blasey Ford. But also, I mean, just from her testimony, I mean, just based on my particular training and understanding of the neurobiology of trauma, I believe her, and that's important. And I encourage everybody to look at the science behind that.
But Shaughnessy and Lael, she didn't say anything 30 years ago. How do you answer that?
That is how this works. It is not often that someone comes forward immediately. In a stranger type of situation, way more common. If I had a stranger rapist, as we called him, a serial rapist who raped women, he abducted them off the side of the street in Indianapolis. And the only reason we got him was because he had a prior felony, and so he was in CODIS. And he, again, thankfully for our sake, he did not use a condom when he raped these women, and so we were able to get him that way. They immediately reported. But just like we talked about earlier, that's not what most sexual assaults are. Most sexual assaults are perpetrated by someone you know, and people are so much less likely to go forward immediately. And
the fact that Miranda, for instance, told family after the second it happened.
She kind of pried it from me. She could tell something was wrong, and
Right.
she was, that I would have, if it weren't for her doing that and questioning me and like and it all happening right then when I got home from it happening, I don't know that I ever would have come forward, because I felt, you know what I mean? Like I was somewhere I shouldn't have been, basically. I didn't, you know what I mean? Even though I told him no and I didn't want to do it, I still did it. I didn't bite him or jump out of a moving, you know what I mean?
Right.
So I had a lot of conflicting emotions with what had actually taken place, and was I wrong in some, so I wouldn't have come forward.
Yeah.
And with Blasey Ford, I mean, that was so long ago, but you got to understand, like, there's something called triggers, and sometimes survivors, I mean, that those memories lay dormant and they move on and they lead successful lives, and then all of a sudden a trigger happens and they remember and they get pissed off. I mean, and so for him to be, you know, I mean, be nominated for the Supreme Court as a Supreme Court judge, I mean, it's just, that was probably a major trigger for her. And then it being out in the media, I can tell you, I mean, I guarantee there is an increase in delayed rape reports around the country from survivors also being triggered by those moments. But it's not uncommon at all for survivors to wait a long time. It just depends on where they're at in their life, their triggers, how they're feeling at the moment. And also to add on this is very important is we got to understand that, especially Blasey Ford 30 years ago, I mean, if you think victim blaming is bad now, I mean, imagine how it was 30 years ago. So, you know, it's already hard today in 2019 for survivors to report and come forward because of victim blaming. So it doesn't surprise me that she didn't report it back then.
Well, I want to thank Miranda for coming and telling her story in such a public way, because it is the thing that gives other women and men to have the courage to tell their story. And, you know, guys, men specifically, I have, through this process of doing the show, learned that men, I mean, you kind of can help me with the statistics, but men are molested or raped at the same rate as women. It is not a female-only problem. But
1 out of 59 men, according to my stats.
And we've got 10,000 people listening. And so if you are one of those guys, it is not easy to come forward and talk about that because, well, people will think I'm gay. We talked about that off air. Or there's a myriad of complications around that. And there's no shame in coming forward and talking about things that are not your fault. So if you're a man or a woman and you're listening to this show, please go to the trusted ones in your life, the loved ones in your life. If you're a victim of anything that we've talked about tonight, go to your support system that you know. I've never in my life, and maybe you two can back me up on this, working in this professionally, I have never had someone come to me or watched other people go to their friends and family and say, I'm a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence, and have anybody have anything other than overwhelming love and empathy for that person when they say that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's the self guilt or the self,
Yeah.
you know,
Shame.
judgment, shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you vigorously shook your head, but it's radio, so please voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, guilt, shame. You mentioned about male victims. They deal with all of the same things that we've talked about with female victims, but other things too. Sexuality. Am I gay? Will people think I'm gay? Masculinity. Those kinds of things, and it further complicates it. And I think that's what leads to there being less and less reporting. But we've got some really great survivors here in our community who come out and speak about that. Male survivors of sexual abuse, both as children and as adults.
Mm-hmm.
And your people will be there for you.
Yeah. Yep. They absolutely will be. So please don't keep that 1% locked away and allow yourself to be ruled by that.
Do you want the hotline again?
Please, because sometimes calling a hotline, and let me tell you, the power of voicing something for the first time, and even if it's to a stranger, getting the words out is the hard part. And then once you've done that, then you can go to somebody else. So yeah, please.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you're a victim of domestic violence, please call the hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Victim and survivor of sexual violence, you can call 1-800-656-4673. Definitely call. Everything's confidential. It's a safe place to talk. So.
All right, so final thoughts. Miranda, you're a longtime veteran. Why don't you show them how final thoughts goes, which is your chance to self-promote or clean up anything that you might have wanted to say.
Oh.
Or summarize, whatever, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would just say we've all, as humans, we all have been victimized at some point. And sometimes we have been maybe even the abuser in a situation. And really, if you feel like you're in that position, if you feel like something's not right, don't ignore your intuition. And regardless of how hard you think the road ahead is, or, if anything can happen, start taking those steps, make those calls. I honestly really was at the lowest I could get. And thank God, we want to bash the government and whatever, but not just us, but in general, people. If it weren't for the fact that he had involved the police, it wouldn't have opened my eyes, but then also that gave me a sense of security. Now that, the government was involved, the police were involved, the judicial system was involved. So when I left, I was able to get away from him. My protective orders were denied, but the fact that I was then I was facing court still over the issue. I ended up being on house arrest, but knowing that the government was there, and I was just, even because I was in trouble, I just felt like I had that backing.
Right.
And so I say, involve people and start making those steps, because no matter how bad the situation is, things will not get better until you do.
Yep. Shaughnessy?
Well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you, Miranda, for telling your story, because it takes an incredible amount of courage to come forward and talk about it, especially in a public forum. But it sounds silly, but just like we said earlier, if you see something, say something, and it doesn't have to come from you. There can be anonymous reports, and it's not going to hurt anything to say something at all. And we are here for you. I know sometimes it seems like to some people that the criminal justice system is very messed up, and it certainly isn't perfect. But we do believe our victims. We want you to come forward, and we want to help you.
Okay, Lael?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and Miranda, thank you so much. And like Shaughnessy said, I mean, it's incredibly courageous to share your story, and survivors are out there listening, and I guarantee that you gave them hope tonight, which is incredibly important. So that's important. That's what I want all of them to know, is that there is hope. I know today's hard. Take it day by day. Definitely contact 211 if you need resources. And then, and I'm thankful for my team. I know Prosecuting Attorneys Council is a state agency that is doing it right. I mean, you can hear everything that Shaughnessy said about, how they're legislating with Senate Bill 531, and they educate advocates like me, so I can talk to them about actually what a plea deal is, because I'm not a lawyer, I'm an advocate, but I need them.
See if your state has something similar, and if not, I'm sure they'll help you.
There is a prosecuting coordinating council of some sort in every single state. Ours is pretty darn active, and we've really branched out and do a lot more. And thank you for your kind words, Layla. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Some
I love you
states
guys
it's
over
only
there.
it's only 2 or 3 people in some states, but it's at least a starting point. And usually do have those relationships with legislators who can help actually affect change.
Yeah, and thank you, and I appreciate that. And maybe we can always, do a second, a part 2 on actual prevention. That's one thing I wanted to end off is that we can, we talked a little bit about Bandura and social learning theory, but we can model healthy behaviors to our children, and I certainly do, and make sure that my husband buys me flowers in front of them, and we don't abuse. It's important. I mean, they're looking to us as models, and so really thinking about that prevention side and how we can sort of be a big brother, big sister to people in the community, like you were saying, and making sure that we understand that it takes a village to raise a child.
Long-term change.
I think that's such an important point. I have people in my family that I think were abused and have never told anybody and have never dealt with that, and they passed on those thinking patterns to their children. And it's up to that generation then to break that cycle. I've seen in my own family people not deal with a child molestation situation. I've seen that is a perpetual generational cycle until you make the choice to change. And so even if you are a victim, the choice of not moving forward can have a generational impact. And so I just think and if you're the abuser, if you're listening to this going, I think I need to examine my own behavior, start moving towards changing your behavior. Accept that this is ugly stuff, but you're redeemable.
Yeah, you may not do it with a malicious intent, but when you realize that you're doing it, it's time to stop.
We've both been in that position where we've been on the other side of the coin, where we've been ugly.
Oh, for sure. And sometimes you don't realize that, but that's just it. It's starting to realize the characteristics of it and noticing, like, you know what, I may not have meant to be that way, but this is what I've done, so I need to maybe check myself.
Yeah. So I just think that's a really important point, that generational
modeling behavior. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, it's prevention is important to talk about too, and there's a whole another 3 hours we can always talk about the prevention.
That's what everybody can think of a time they were victimized.
Let's pause in round 2. No, I'm just kidding.
All right. Yeah.
All right. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our patrons for making this possible. There's not many shows that are doing this kind of stuff, and I think it's really important. And our patrons really support that, especially Christy Avery, Craig DaCosta, Jason Doolittle.
I love you, Christy.
Memerty Libs and the Libertarian Coalition. They really go the extra mile in supporting us. I want to thank the listeners. When we do these kind of shows, they're always they're not our typical type of show. And I always end these shows and I go, that was depressing and that was heavy. And then I get the emails from you guys saying, man, that really made me think about my own behavior. And that, as much as anything else, keeps this show going, and we do more of this kind of stuff that has this type of impact because of your letters, letting us know how this kind of stuff, letting, the time that the 3 of them took to do this, to come in and talk to you. I'll share that with them if you want. I'll put you in contact with them. But, if you know somebody, like, share the episode too. I mean, say, listen, this is heavy, but I know that maybe you heard something and it's worth sharing. So thank you, Miranda, for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
Missed you. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you, Shaughnessy and Lael, for taking the time to come and do this.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, you guys were awesome.
Thank you for hosting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And thank you for being an advocate for men, or voice for men and things like that.
Thank you. Yeah. I think that men have it rough right now, and I know that sounds countercultural to what we're supposed to.
Not you and your male privilege.
Right. But I think
that's the shift.
The conversation, I think part of the reason that there's a brokenness in men is that we're not having those conversations. And so that's why I think some of this is important, and being sensitive to men too. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and thank you for supporting the program. And please don't be afraid to email us at editor@wearelibertarians.com. Thank you, and we'll talk to you next week.